Chapter 251. Machine Number 1, Kinetic Energy Output Normal. Engine Auxiliary Computer Parameters Normal, Fire Control Radar Ineffective. Information Capture System 46% Delay. Main Firepower System Energy Transfer Complete. Machine Number 2, Energy Input System Damaged, Degree Unknown. Onboard computer has abnormal parameters. Belly engine room damaged, leakage situation occurring. Main Firepower System Energy Transfer Complete. The battle of the new MX mecha on Old Moon had been going on for so long, but the computer system in the command hall had only just finished analyzing the data for the first time. It wasn't that Madman Li and Su Lu, who were piloting the mecha, had already made the dual-engine mecha's battle speed exceed the computer's calculation range. It was just that the battle situation had been so intense that the people in the command hall simply had no time to deal with these things. Machine Number 1 was the purple seed developed by the Federal Academy of Science. Machine Number 2 was the little white flower developed by the Shell Motor Company. Hearing the electronically synthesized female voice report the damage of both sides, the people in the command hall each had a different expression. The previous battle had already shown that in a face-to-face battle with the new mecha, the long-range weapon system could no longer be used to its full potential. Therefore, whether it was Li Feng operating the purple sea or Su Lu operating the little white flower, they had all transferred the backup energy of the main firepower system to the mobility aspect at the first opportunity. The decisive choice of the two pilots under Mount Kaki, as well as the courage, confidence, and decisiveness contained in this choice, made the professionals in the command hall feel an unnatural chill. Starting acceleration data, MDX control efficiency parameters, joint engine platinum clutch spacing, following the appearance of various numerical units, the battle data of the new MX mecha hundreds of thousands of kilometers away was transmitted back to the command hall of Planet S1 through the first level of the electronic monitoring network. One only needed to perform a simple comparison of data to discover that the Purple Sea mecha developed by the Federation's Academy of Sciences had an overall advantage, especially in terms of the power output of the main twin engines, which had an overflow value of close to 10%. In a mecha battle, such a large difference in power output was enough to determine victory and defeat. In the right half of the command hall, the Academy of Science experts had calm and confident expressions. The technicians of the Shell Motor Company on the left looked at the data flashing below the giant holographic screen. Their expressions were somewhat grave. The Purple Sea mecha had the advantage in terms of performance, and it was obvious that although the pilot piloting the little white flower mecha was also very capable, under Madman Li's ferocious attacks, he still paled in comparison. With the two added together, the people in the command hall all thought that the Purple Sea mecha from the Academy of Sciences would win. The head of the maneuver department of Number 1 Hospital pulled up the visual data of the pilot's control. Looking at the data of the two pilots' hand speed on the screen, his pupils could not help but shrink. It was understandable that Li Feng, who was controlling the Purple Sea, could reach such a frightening hand speed. Who knew which ace pilot the Nutshell Company had poached from the military? His hand speed was also frightening. Just as the people in the command hall found the rare time to analyze the mecha data of both sides, the image on the giant screen changed once more. The Purple Sea mecha seemed to not know fatigue at all, and did not care about the damage to its head. After pausing for a moment on the spot, it turned into a beautiful purple light and stepped on the soft surface of the moon, rushing towards the little white flower. The white mecha was like a fragile flower. There were already many cracks on its exterior. Facing the Purple Sea's attack again, this mecha made a response that no one had expected. Under the blazing light, the little white flower mecha's two engines were fully activated. In an instant, it reached the peak of 4 times its original power. Two smooth auxiliary flying wings slid out from the back of the mecha's waist. As the small jets under the auxiliary flying wings spat out air, the white mecha's figure shook violently. Following the surface of the weathered surface, it quickly flashed towards the back. With the help of the auxiliary flying wings, the MX mecha from the Nutshell Company displayed its highest speed for the first time. It was as if a gust of wind had blown past it, instantly disappearing into the large shadow behind it. That was the shadow of the Kachi mountain range. On the other side, the Purple Sea mecha was still in mid-air, executing an extremely fierce mecha attack maneuver. However, in response to the sudden change in the white mecha, the Purple Sea mecha spread out its auxiliary flying wings and glided down from a height of 10 meters in the air. Using the momentum, the Purple Sea mecha forcefully accelerated, and just as it was about to land on the ground, the Purple Sea mecha changed the direction of its descent to smoothly chase after that patch of shadows. Little White Flower and Purple Sea, one in front and one behind, were like two shooting stars traversing the vast universe. They flashed across the screen and disappeared without a trace. The comprehensive surveillance system only took 0.17 seconds to capture the two MX mecha's figures. The high-sensitivity satellite above the polar region of the Old Moon was faithfully watching the two mecha moving quickly in the shadows of the Kachi mountain range. These images were transmitted to the eyes of the spectators. Today's MX mecha battle test had greatly stimulated the spectators in the command hall of the Old Moon base. For those military representatives who had been immersed in mecha piloting for decades, the way the Purple Sea mecha operated and the strange movements of Little White Flower's mecha as it dodged were the source of their shock. For those mechanics experts and engineers, the performance of these two new MX mecha was the real reason why they were dumbfounded. Especially when the two mecha, one in front and one behind, extended their auxiliary flying wings at almost the same time, instantly raising the speed of the mecha to a level never before seen in the Federation mecha. Everyone gasped in surprise. The experts from the Shell Motor Company and the Federal Academy of Science had long simulated and even seen with their own eyes how terrifying the absolute speed of the MX mecha was with the assistance of the auxiliary flying wings. But today, witnessing with their own eyes the appearance of this kind of speed in the distant Old Moon base, they still found it hard to contain their excitement. After the excitement, there was a natural round of applause. Everyone on and off the stage stood up and began to clap, moved and proud by the revolutionary breakthrough of the Federation mecha. On the huge widescreen screen, the two mecha were operating at full power, switching from combat mode to running mode. They were running at full speed through the rugged Old Moon mountain range without any footholds. This scene was filled with a thrilling sense of beauty. And in sync with the tense atmosphere on the screen, the various data being fed back to the command hall also began to rise again. CLK is moving up in a curve. CLS is approaching its peak. ADS adaptive suspension entering a passive wear and tear period. Not everyone in the command hall could understand these technical terms, but those important figures heard the electronic synchronized sound become more hurried. Their hearts also became nervous. Looking at the graphical color bar graph on one side of the large screen, they knew that the power output of the two MX mecha on Kachi Mountain was getting higher and higher, almost reaching its limit. Another 2 minutes passed. The data fed back to the ground clearly showed that the power output of the two mecha was constantly fluctuating around its peak. Shang Qiu gripped the pen in her hand tightly, staring at the graphic display on the monitor in front of her. Her full breasts rose and fell continuously due to her rapid breathing. She was a calm engineer, but at this moment, she could no longer remain calm. She did not understand the specific reason, but she had already guessed that the person inside the Little White Flower mecha should be Su Lu. This was because only Su Lu, herself, and Bai Yulan knew the biggest flaw of the Purple Sea mecha. Now that Bai Yulan had already been arrested by the Bureau of Proclamation, other than Su Lu, who else would still throw caution to the wind and use Kachi mountain range to speed up and bring the Purple Sea mecha into overclocking mode? However, at this time, the Purple Sea mecha on the screen kept its distance from the Little White Flower mecha in front of it, maintaining the power output of its twin engines near its peak. Occasionally, it would enter overclocking mode for 1 or 2 seconds before automatically lowering its power output. The Purple Sea mecha seemed to rather not catch up to the Little White Flower mecha than forcefully increase its speed at this time. Could it be that the Academy of Science has found out? Shang Qiu subconsciously used the tip of her pen to scratch her itchy forehead, completely oblivious to the light blue ink smeared on the side of her eyebrows. She wondered nervously in her heart, if the other had really discovered the problem with the Purple Sea mecha, then what would Sulu, who was currently inside the White Flower mecha, do? How could he really drive that madmanly crazy and force the Purple Sea mecha into overclocking? In the silent polar regions of the moon, in the shadows of the mountain ranges, the white mecha was like a speck of light in the dark night. One moment, it was still under a rock, and the next moment, it was using its alloy fingers to claw at a corner of the cliff and climb up. The mecha's movements were not too affected by the damage. Instead, it became more and more practiced, like a monkey leaping swiftly through the mountains. It was impossible for there to be any plants on Kachi mountain range. It looked barren, but those heavily weathered cliffs and those places where one could fall at any time were actually all traps. The MX mecha could only turn its body, weighing tens of tons, into a nimble and leaping figure, with the help of both engines and auxiliary wings. In the dark, cold, and bleak shadow of the back of Kachi mountain range, the temperature in the air had already dropped to -60 degrees after just a few degrees of separation from the S1 sun. Because there was no water vapor, no frost appeared on the smooth surface of the mecha. However, the alloy surface mixed with weathered sand and stone had some indescribable changes. The outer armor's automatic temperature control system had already been turned off. In the dark cockpit, Su Li's eyes stared intently at the various data parameters provided by the onboard computer, especially the CLS value and ADS value. The mecha's power output had already reached its peak several times, and the adaptive suspension system could no longer hold on for much longer. After all, sprinting at full speed in an environment like Kachi mountain range was too taxing on the mecha's body. Huff, huff. Other than the sound of static, the cockpit was silent. Su Li's heavy breathing was exceptionally clear. His control of Little White Flower was becoming smoother and smoother. The mecha control techniques he had painstakingly studied in the past, under the pressure of the Purple Sea mecha behind him, were almost like those 10 stances, becoming instinctive to his body. It was only in this way that he could rely on the simulation system and those combat stances to last until now in the face of Madman Li's terrifying strength. However, the Purple Sea mecha chasing behind him cast a shadow over Su Li's heart. The murderous aura on that mecha was so intimidating that it actually made one feel as if they could not win. Earlier, on the weathered surface at the foot of the mountain, Little White Flower's mecha had kicked backwards in the air, successfully destroying the complex fire control system at the head of the Purple Sea mecha. However, no one had expected that the Purple Sea mecha would actually be able to skillfully control its power system in midair. It abruptly moved horizontally, and its mechanical leg bent horizontally to strike Little White Flower's abdomen. It looked like both sides had suffered damage, but Sulu knew that he had made a big mistake. Compared to Madman Li in the Purple Sea mecha, Sulu did not have any advantage in mecha piloting. Even with the help of the simulation system, he still could not compare to that young lieutenant colonel who had been immersed in mecha piloting since he was a child. The only area in which he was better than Madman Li was his deep understanding of mecha structures. From the time he had repaired the old M mecha on the ancient Bell, all the way until he had entered the Shell Engineering Division to help with the creation of the MX mecha, he could not be more familiar with every component, every circuit, every chipset, and every position of every transmission rod in a mecha. However, it was precisely because of this habitual thinking that Sulu had chosen to target the head of the Purple Sea mecha, which had been integrated with most of its information capture system, when the white mecha had taken the risk to strike at the foot of the mountain. However, Madman Li did not seem to care about this at all. He brutally and domineeringly traded injury for injury. It was not until the dust had settled and the palm print had landed on the ground that Sulu understood that the most terrifying destructive power of the MX mecha was in close combat. The fire control radar was no longer as important as it had been in the past. Meanwhile, in order to destroy the opponent's fire control radar, Little White Flower's mecha had paid the price of damaging its energy transmission system. Rocks slid down the mountain. In the darkness, the white mecha quickly and accurately found another point to leverage on. Its nimble mechanical alloy toes dug into the crevices of the rocks, and with the silent vibration of the engine and the white turbulence of the auxiliary wing jets, the body of the mecha suddenly shot up. It came to a gentle slope and charged upwards. The weathered sand and stones on the slope of the valley were silently disintegrated by the heavy body of the mecha, constantly trembling and undulating. In a situation where the maximum power output was at a disadvantage, the Shell Engineering Division's little white flower mecha still possessed a speed that did not lose out to the Purple Sea mecha. On one hand, it relied on Shang Qiutian's dynamic design. On the other hand, it also proved that the Shell Engineering Division was indeed worthy of its reputation as a mecha designer for the federal military. In the field of mecha design, it was still ahead of the Academy of Science. The chase between Little White and the Purple Sea mecha had already lasted for more than 10 minutes. The harsh environment of ultra-low temperature did not seem to affect the performance of the two MX mecha. Their speed was still extremely fast, and the distance between them was still maintained extremely well. Sulu breathed heavily. He focused on controlling Little White Flower to perform one difficult movement after another. His control became more and more practiced, but his heart became heavier and heavier. He had never imagined that he could control a mecha and truly defeat Mad Manly, but he knew some things that Mad Manly did not know. He had been waiting for the other to enter overclocking mode, but why was the Purple Sea mecha behind him not willing to forcefully increase its speed and catch up to him? The low-temperature vacuum environment was extremely disadvantageous for the MX's energy consumption. Mad Manly in the Purple Sea had been through hundreds of battles. It was impossible for him not to know this. Why was he willing to drag it out like this? The blazing light of the stars shone over the top of the mountain and into the mecha's field of vision, dispelling the cold and darkness. Little White Flower's mecha did a high-speed somersault to the top of the mountain. Then it turned back. What does he want to do? The giant screen showed the image of Little White Flower's mecha leaping to the top of Mount Kaki and then turning back. No one knew how the Federation's electronic surveillance system did it, but the real-time image on the screen had a very high resolution rate. The angle of view was also very beautiful. It was obvious that it was not captured by a high-altitude satellite. The mecha chase that lasted for more than 10 minutes seemed to be a little dull. This was originally a silent battle, but the performance of the two mecha at the foot of the mountain and their exquisite control was enough to excite the audience. In these 10 minutes, in the shadows of Mount Kaki, only the white and purple mecha could be seen moving forward at high speed. This went on for a very long time. The data and computer analysis already showed the people in the command hall and Old Moon Assembly Base that the Academy of Science's Purple Sea mecha had the upper hand. As for Little White Flower's mecha running up the mountain, everyone was shocked, but they also gradually understood the thoughts of the pilot. Until now, there were still not many people who knew that the pilot in the white mecha was a technical supervisor. They all thought that the pilot must also be an absolutely outstanding ace pilot of the Federation military. Thus, when the image of the white mecha braking and turning around appeared on the screen, everyone felt a strong sense of suspicion. Faced with the overwhelming advantage of the Purple Sea mecha and Li Feng's unstoppable attacks, why would this unknown ace pilot give up the rare balance of speed and stop at the top of the mountain? At this point in the battle, the Federal Academy of Science's Purple Sea mecha's performance advantage was shown, so the engineers in the command hall were very calm. Shang Qiu, who had a few traces of blue ink at the corner of his eyebrows, looked in that direction, then turned back to look at Lin Yuanhu behind him. Seeing the old man's calm and confident expression, he could not help but snort coldly in his heart. The performance of the Purple Sea mecha depended on its design, and the function model that the design was based on had a parameter error. The MX designed by Nutshell Company was to fix that parameter error, and a part of its performance was sacrificed. No one in the command hall knew this better than Shang Qiu, but the situation was one-sided, and even if she wanted to put on a confident expression, it was extremely difficult. She only knew that Little White Flower was standing at the top of Mount Kaki and turning back. He must be thinking of a way to drag the Purple Sea into overclocking, but she did not know what that guy was going to do. Suddenly, a middle-aged expert beside her touched her shoulder and said hurriedly, "What is Little White Flower doing?" Shang Qiu quickly turned to look at the screen, and her red lips could not help but open slightly. Like everyone in the command hall, she let out an exaggerated gasp. On the giant screen, the white mecha's mechanical arm extended a repair arm from the front, pressing against the heavily damaged abdomen of the mecha, as if some kind of repair work was being done. Chapter 252. Shang-Chiu subconsciously covered her mouth. She knew that Little White Flower MX had some spare parts under its cockpit, but she never would have thought that the pilot would actually choose to repair himself at this time when Little White Flower stood trembling on the peak and the Purple Sea would attack in an instant. Strength was gained through hard work, but confidence was gained through actual combat. At this point in the battle, Sulu was deeply impressed by Madman Li's unfathomable mecha control ability. At the same time, he also gained a lot of confidence in himself. At this moment, he finally understood that those days when he was tortured beyond recognition by the Level 6 virtual reality test in Area H1 of Lihua University were not in vain. At the beginning of the year, from Tai Ziyuan's words, he already knew how frightening the Level 6 mecha test was. He believed that his control method using the simulation system, if converted to hand speed, should already be close to the standard of an ace pilot in the military. In addition to the high-intensity mecha operation training he had undergone some time ago in the Whitewater underground base on the outskirts of the capital, he believed in his own mecha control ability. Because of this confidence, Sulu had listened to Bai Yulan's soft instructions before she left and temporarily replaced Zhou Yu's pilot position. Unfortunately, Madman Li was stronger, extraordinarily strong. The youth who entered the Purple Sea mecha was even scarier than his violent and tyrannical self. There were clearly dozens of tons of metal between them, but it could not stop that person from displaying his murderous aura through the ice-cold machine. At this time, Sulu would rather fight the opponent one-on-one with his fists and legs than face him in a mecha. At this moment, he could not help but think of that Imperial Princess Tai Ziyuan had mentioned. She had entered the realm of level 6 at the age of 12. Madman Li had also entered the battlefield at the age of 12. Could it be that this world really had monsters who were born with knowledge? The thing that made Sulu feel the most vigilant, the fact that even his heart that was as hard as a rock was somewhat shaken, was that the Purple Sea that had always been following behind him didn't enter an overclocking state and forcibly increase its speed to intercept him on the way to Kaki Peak like he had planned. Why did the Purple Sea, which had been so crazy and violent before, suddenly become so calm and indifferent? His ruthless style coupled with his absolutely calm thinking, and the fact that he was only 16 years old, this type of opponent was truly too frightening. The Lees of Philadelphia, the god of war, the old man, and the uncles, were all the monsters in this universe related to them? When he was thinking about these things, Sulu was not like the ancient swordsman who stood on the peak and waited for the arrival of the Purple Sea mecha. He was a youth with 3 qualities who treated others in a traditional way, but he was not stupid enough to ask for a battle that involved killing, nor would he follow some kind of rigid rules. The Little White Flower mecha stood steadily on the edge of the platform at the peak. The long-range weapon on its left arm had already been switched on. Without the backup power of the firepower system, it was unable to activate the main cannon. However, the rotating barrel of the Darlin's gun continued to spray out those light dots that represented high-speed projectiles, continuously shooting towards the rugged path below the cliff. It was a pity that the gun barrel on the mecha's left arm did not have a clear clicking sound as an accompaniment. The low-light projectiles were also unable to shatter the weathered lunar mountain and bring more trouble to the figure of the Purple Sea mecha. The Purple Sea mecha silently and swiftly executed incomparably awesome evasive maneuvers on the cliff, dodging all of the projectiles that Little White Flower had shot out. Sulu had hoped that during the test, his long-range attacks would be able to hit the Purple Sea, or at least force the opponent off the peak. He had only hoped to delay the opponent from reaching the peak, and in reality, he had achieved this. The precise point of impact, as if he could predict the trajectory of the Purple Sea mecha's evasive maneuvers, made even Li Feng, who was controlling the Purple Sea, feel extremely troubled. By the time he neared the peak, another 3 minutes had already passed. In these 3 minutes, Little White Flower's right mechanical arm had not been idle. Instead, it had rapidly carried out self-repair work. In a typical mecha battle, it was simply impossible to give a mechanic any time to repair, but today, in the special environment of the Old Moon Khaki mountain range, the white mecha had managed to do this. This was because the one controlling it was Sulu. In terms of mecha piloting skills, Sulu was a far cry from Mad Manly, but in terms of mecha repair ability, there really were not many people in the Federation who were better than him. The left mechanical arm fired accurately and quickly, while the right mechanical arm calmly carried out its repair work. Between movement and silence, the little white flowers mecha towering on the peak of the mountain gave all the spectators who could see this scene a very special feeling. Repairing mecha in the middle of a battle had already left the people in the ground command hall dumbfounded, and right now, the white mecha was clearly carrying out a double-layered operation. The difficulty of this kind of operation was obvious, but Sulu carried it out extremely smoothly. He used the simulation system in conjunction with the control stick and the touch screen to carry out these two operations at the same time, so it was not difficult to use them. The ground trembled violently, and the mechanical right arm completed the last critical component replacement. Sulu looked at the digital model descending from the sky in his helmet's field of vision. The heat in his body surged, and he entered the control signal into the mecha. Little White Flower's mecha's joint engines were all on full blast, and it slid diagonally backwards across the surface of the platform at the peak of the mountain, moving straight back 70 meters. There was no sound, but there seemed to be a loud boom. The Purple Sea mecha dodged the last bullet line, shot up into the sky, and fell swiftly and violently. Like a meteorite, it smashed heavily into the position where Little White Flower had been standing just a moment ago. The onboard computer quickly performed a self-check. Sulu knew that most of the kinetic energy input device had been repaired. There could not have been too many backup components in the Nutshell MX design to begin with. It was just an extremely critical component, and it had an extremely small weight. To be able to repair it to this extent, he was already very satisfied. Purple Sea did not charge over like before, but instead stood quietly by the cliff's edge, watching as Little White Flower slowly retracted the repair arm on the right mechanical arm. It seemed that it also felt that the other was very strange, actually choosing to carry out repair work at this time. Inside the Purple Sea mecha, Li Feng did not enter any attack orders. He looked through the field of vision in his helmet at the somewhat tattered white mecha not far away, and remained silent the entire time. Due to the severe damage to the head's information capture system, the fire control radars had all failed. At this time, the onboard computer could not calculate the current situation of the white mecha in time, but just looking at the other like this with visible light, the 16-year-old suddenly felt that it was very interesting. Li Feng's hands left the control stick and touch screen, slowly moving the joints around his wrists, and then he put them back on. He was wearing a specially made control suit, and nothing out of the ordinary could be seen. It tightly wrapped around his burly and powerful body, and on that face that still had the childish expression of adolescence flashed a hint of contemplation that did not match his age. He had joined the army at the age of 12, and had entered the virtual level 6 level in the military's secret test back then. Li Feng knew that in this entire universe, probably only the princess of a faraway empire could be mentioned in the same breath as him. Arrogance, ruthlessness, and the impulse to smash everything in the world came from his bizarre teenage life and his own super strength. To put it bluntly, the greater the strength, the greater the responsibility, and the more intimidating the aura would be. Li Feng was 16 years old, and it was impossible for him to be like his grandfather in the manner of Feicheng, who was as deep as the well, shining with disdain like the eternal stars. However, the bloody battles on the front lines, the countless experiences of escaping from the Empire's mecha ambushes, the wreckage of the pirate ships floating in space, and the bodies of his comrades that flowed like a stream of blood, made this Federation's youngest lieutenant colonel mature at a somewhat abnormal speed. Perhaps, this was the real reason why the war god sent him to join the army back then. Li Feng, who could survive that kind of environment, was definitely not a madman who only had strength and no brains. Although his personality was a bit crazy, once he entered the battlefield, under the cover of his crazy appearance, he would enter into absolute calmness. That was why, from the start of the battle until now, even when he had such a good pursuit maneuver when he had entered the shadow region of the Khaki mountain range, Li Feng had used his steel-like nerves to forcefully control himself and this purple sea mecha beneath him. Nothing could be done to the extreme, and unless it was the most dangerous moment, Madman Li would definitely not allow himself to truly go crazy and use control methods that were beyond his control, such as overclocking. The pilot in the white mecha opposite him was very interesting. Li Feng looked at the opponent in his field of vision who seemed to be facing a great enemy, and the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. What was interesting was not because this person actually dared to self-repair in the middle of a fierce battle, but because at the foot of the mountain, this pilot was actually able to withstand the continuous attacks of the Purple Sea. Only Li Feng himself knew how frightening that series of ferocious attacks were. His family's legacy combined with this dual-engine high-power mecha, once they were combined, even he himself was a little shocked by the power they produced. He even thought that even the guy with the surname Tian that the brats in the Westwoods military often mentioned, or Commander Zhong personally piloted the mecha, under his previous series of attacks, he was afraid that he would not be able to withstand it. But the pilot in the nutshell had managed to withstand it. Although the blocking was extremely difficult, he had still managed to protect the important parts of the mecha. What made Li Feng even more wary was that he caught a trace of a familiar style from the non-standard tactical movements of the white mecha. It was different from his own style, but it always seemed to be able to predict his movements in advance. Moreover, every time the white mecha made a move, it was so accurate, as if it could perfectly coordinate with his own attacks. This guy is not bad. Li Feng made this evaluation of this pilot in his heart, and because of that trace of wariness in his heart, he secretly raised the other's danger level by another level. However, he had never thought of using this mecha battle test to do anything to this pilot, because he was very confident that the final victor would be him, and the Federal Army just happened to be in need of excellent pilots like the other. Right at this moment, a dark green indicator light in the cockpit of the mecha lit up. Li Feng glanced at it indifferently, and knew that this was the Federal Military's standard equipment, a short-range encrypted communication system. It was used by the military to carry out small-scale team cooperation under the enemy's electronic attacks. Admit defeat. At this time, on the desolate peak of Old Moon Mountain, the only one who could carry out a short-range encrypted communication between mecha was the white mecha opposite. Although Li Feng did not quite understand, he still spoke first, and with such a matter-of-fact tone, he said coldly, "The mecha is my strong suit, and the piloting is also my better. You don't have a chance." The other end of the communication system was silent for a few seconds, and then a slightly hoarse young voice rang out, "But I still want to tear down your house sign, and you still want to call me uncle." Chapter 253. Li Feng, who was in the cockpit of the Purple Sea mech, narrowed his eyes when he heard these two words. He knew who the pilot in the white mech in front of him was. Then, he fell silent. Ever since he had found out that he was going to participate in the MX Mecha battle test, Li Feng had never bothered to find out who the nutshell mecha pilot was. Even though he had killed his way from the foot of Mount Khaki all the way to the peak, he still did not pay too much attention to this unknown pilot. Even if an ace pilot from the Empire suddenly appeared in the white mech, he would not be so surprised. When it came to opponents, Madman Li would always just defeat them and step on them. Since that was the case, what difference did it make who the opponent was? However, he would never have thought that the pilot in the white mech would actually be that skinny technical director. Li Feng did not know that Su Lu was now officially part of the federal military. He thought that he was still a civilian second lieutenant. From his perspective, Su Lu had once displayed exceptionally strong close combat abilities in Linyuan. However, fighting was always different from operating a mech. How could the other party be so strong in a mech? Li Feng's eyebrows furrowed. Through the distorted vision of his helmet, he looked at the quiet white mecha in front of him. The shock in his heart dissipated after a long time. He said coldly, "You really do surprise me. Since it's a bet between us, of course I have to defeat you personally. I don't think it's appropriate to let anyone else destroy the house sign of Philadelphia." Su Lu listened to Li Feng's voice from the communicator and said coldly. Waiting for him at the peak, revealing his identity, everything he did was just to provoke the other party. If things had gone according to the previous course of events, Su Lu knew that he was destined to be the loser of the mecha battle. If he wanted to infuriate Li Feng, who was absolutely calm in battle yet was able to display a crazed aura, other than that bet and the fact that he was in a mecha, he could not think of any other way. Li Feng frowned. He looked at the white mech in his field of vision and suddenly said, "You really surprised me. But congratulations, you've successfully provoked my desire to kill you." "That's my wish," Su Lu thought silently in his heart. Then, he heard Madman Li's cold voice from the communicator. "I don't know why you brought the mech to the peak, but I can tell you this. Before coming to the base, I've already looked at the surface features of the polar regions of Old Moon. On this peak, you have no way out. On this point, I've taken advantage of you." The successor of the Lees of Philadelphia had a special status in the federal military. Before coming to Old Moon, naturally, there were military staff members who had drawn up the terrain features of the battleground for Madman Li. Su Lu heard Madman Li admit it himself and felt a little complicated. Although this young genius lieutenant colonel was violent and arrogant, in a direct battle, he did not lose his integrity. Su Lu suddenly thought of his real intention of dragging the other into the overclocking battle. After a moment of silence, he stopped thinking about this problem and said, "Work hard. Actually, I'm only a few years older than you. I don't want to be your uncle." After saying this sentence full of mockery, Su Lu took 2 deep breaths, opened a safety valve beside the control stick, and lightly pressed the start button. Hearing the voice from the communicator, Madman Li's delicate features flashed with a trace of darkness. Su Li's voice was very calm, but it was this calmness that made Madman Li feel a trace of humiliation. "You want to tear down the Li family of Philadelphia? You want to humiliate me? You actually want to participate in the mecha battle personally?" Su Li's choice surprised him, but he also felt that it was a challenge. His delicate features gradually calmed down, but a cold murderous intent had already risen up like a burning fire. It followed his body and fingers, and transmitted to the heavy and huge purple sea mecha. The superclose encrypted conversation was not captured by satellites or electronic surveillance networks. Whether it was in the Old Moon base's viewing room or in the S1 Capital's command hall, there was no third person who could hear the conversation between Su Lu and Madman Li. The people watched the huge widescreen screen. On the screen, the purple sea mecha and the little white flower mecha stood at the peak of Kaki Peak, at the border between light and shadow. No one dared to blink. They did not know what kind of surprise the 2 powerful pilots inside these 2 latest MX mecha would bring them in the next moment. However, at this time, the people were only puzzled. After the purple sea mecha caught up to the peak, it did not immediately launch a wild attack like before. That little white flower mecha also did not escape in a wretched and delicate manner. The 2 mecha, each 7 meters tall, just stood silently on the peak, like 2 divine statues overlooking the mortal world. "What are they doing? Don't tell me they've run out of energy?" asked an official in the command hall with a frown. The military bigwigs beside him ignored this official because they knew very well that the self-contained energy of the MX mecha was enough to support this new mecha for several hours of continuous battle. However, they did not mock this official, because looking at the 2 silent mecha on the screen, these military bigwigs also did not know what was going on. According to the battle style of the old war god, how could that brat Madman Li be so stupid as to pay attention to elegance in battle? Director Lin Yuanhu, who had been sitting quietly on the stage, suddenly leaned forward and then sat up straight. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the 2 silent mecha on the screen. He could vaguely guess what was going to happen next. He was not worried at all because he believed in the performance of the purple sea mecha and Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng's absolute strength. However, why did he feel a chill in his chest? Could it be that as he got older, he could no longer withstand stimulation? What's going on? On the left side of the command hall, the experts from the Nutshell Engineering Department stared blankly at the data and asked with some unease. Perhaps these two pilots sympathized with each other and could not help themselves. Shang Qiu said with a smile as she took a tissue from a staff member beside her and wiped the blue ink from the corner of her eyes. Seeing this scene, her heart finally relaxed a little. Although she did not know what had happened on the distant cocky peak of the old moon, it was clear that neither Su Lu nor Madman Li were willing to wait any longer. What happened? The crowd in the command hall was all discussing what was happening on the screen, but this voice was especially panicked and loud. The 1st Military Academy's Mobility Department director on the stage stood up abruptly again. He was the first to notice the abnormal situation of the two mecha on the peak. He pointed at the screen and shouted loudly at the engineering staff below. On the wide screen, although the temperature on the peak of Kaki Peak was high, because of the weathered rocks and white light, it appeared incomparably cold and desolate. The little white flower mecha and the purple sea mecha exhaled several extremely fine streams of air almost at the same time. Those milky white streams of air shot out quickly, just like the old-fashioned steam locomotives in museums, but also like two leaky old-fashioned boilers. The people watching this scene could not hear the sound on the peak of Kaki Peak, but they seemed to be able to hear the sizzling sound coming from beside their ears. That was the sound of the high-speed streams of air. The fine white streams of air stopped as soon as they shot out. The two mecha on the peak still stood quietly, but then a metal component fell off from the white mecha's mechanical arm and smashed heavily into the weathered rocks on the peak, stirring up a cloud of dust. Another object fell heavily, and the dust rose again. At the same time, the purple sea mecha not far away also began to shed its components. Those components also fell to the ground, shaking up the dust. The dust filled the peak and gradually covered the figures of the two mecha. Then, it gradually calmed down, revealing their true appearance. It was still the two MX mecha, one purple and one white. Around the mechanical legs of the mecha were countless pieces of equipment of various sizes scattered. It was like a reptile shedding its skin, or like a branch full of fruit, unwilling to bear the heavy weight anymore. The branch broke, and the fruit fell. These comparisons were actually not appropriate. These two MX mecha were actually like two humans who had suddenly entered the height of summer from the dead of winter, shedding all of the thick and heavy cotton jackets on their bodies. Mecha number 2, long-range weapon system automatically detached. Auxiliary balancer ejected. Alloy plate caterpillar detached. Hidden repair arm detached. Block 41 hidden door opened, firmware detached. Mecha number 1, weapon system confirmed to have failed and detached. Infrared auxiliary capture system detached. Alloy plate caterpillar detached. As the two MX mecha on the screen began to shed their components, the electronically synthesized voice in the command hall once again sounded. The cold electronically synthesized female voice fell into the ears of the people in the hall, but it stirred up endless shock. However, these shocks were all very well suppressed in the hearts of the people. They silently and nervously watched everything on the screen. Only now did they know that those thin white streams of air that had danced wildly like silver snakes in the vacuum earlier were the connection devices used to separate these components from the mecha body. However, other than the expert engineers from the Nutshell Engineering Department and the Federal Academy of Science, many of the other important figures watching the battle did not understand why the two MX mecha on the mountain peak would do such a thing at this time. Mecha number 1, dual engines on full power, joint microengine power synthesis, auxiliary flying wing engine on full power, power breaking the upper limit, entering the 15% range. Mecha number 2, dual engines on full power, joint microengine power synthesis, attention please, officially entering overclocking mode. Attention please, officially entering overclocking mode. The people in the command hall were first silent, and then they immediately began to silently bustle about. The technicians and experts in the three areas at the front of the hall began to record data. The people watching the battle did not need to personally deal with this situation, but under the commentary of the technicians at the side, they also fell into a tense silence. On the screen, the red beam of light that represented the mecha's power output had been continuously rising, and had long broken through the line that represented safety. The technicians and experts stared nervously at the part of the system they were responsible for, and no one on the viewing platform was talking. This was because everyone knew the horrors of overclocking mode, and knew that the time to truly test the new MX Mecha had arrived. Removing all long-range redundant devices, integrating all the power of the mecha's joint microengine, discarding the heavy firepower system, and forcibly adjusting the position of the electronic jets to provide power beyond the limits of the mecha, this was overclocking mode. This was the absolute state for close combat in the design concept of the new mecha, but it was also the most dangerous state. If this was on a real battlefield, a combat mecha in overclocking mode was basically the same as fighting to survive. This was because at this time, the mecha no longer had a complete life support system and long-range capabilities. In a situation where there was no strong backup, even if the opponent was defeated, the only thing left for this mecha in the end was the possibility of self-destruction. The two MX mecha participating in the test on the summit of Kaki Peak had simultaneously detached themselves from those life-saving components and entered an overclocked combat state at almost the same time. This was putting themselves in a death zone where they could not lose, where they could not retreat. This was not the planned arrangement of the battle test, and the risk was extremely high. What reason had prompted those two pilots to make such a decision? Could it be because of the hypocritical silence earlier? On the viewing platform, Lin Yuanhu slowly stood up and stared at the mecha images on the giant screen, silent for a long time. Below the viewing platform, the people in the Nutshell Engineering Department were busy tracking Little White Flower's data, ensuring that the overclocking power was within the acceptable range of the engine material. No one noticed that Shang Qiu had already left her workstation. She walked to the bottom of the screen and looked up, clenching her hands tightly as she counted silently in her heart. 175,174. On the summit, Little White Flower's mecha suddenly trembled. It only trembled a little before it stuck close to the weathered rock surface of the platform and swept towards the Purple Sea mecha. If it was said that the high speed of the 2MX mecha in running mode with the help of the auxiliary flying wings had already shocked everyone in the command hall, then the mecha's movements in overclocking mode right now were so fast that it was almost a blur. The surrounding dust and smoke kicked up by the heavy mecha's footsteps could not keep up with the movements of that white shadow at all. The Purple Sea mecha's speed was faster than Little White Flower's, and its movements were more precise and direct. Its heavy mechanical legs were as nimble as air. The spherical joints opened slightly, and the body of the mecha made a strange twist, causing the alloy-toothed blade in front of the white mecha's mechanical arm to graze the white mecha's right arm. The Purple Sea mecha's right shoulder trembled, and the three-edged alloy blade at the front of the mechanical arm stabbed viciously into the white mecha's side ribs. There was no strong wind at the summit, but a great cloud of dust and smoke covered the sky. The two newest MX mecha were like two fearless warriors in the midst of the dust and smoke, neither retreating nor escaping. The anti-skid mechanical legs gripped the ground tightly as they performed extremely difficult attacks and chops. In less than 20 seconds, who knew how many alloy fists had smashed heavily into each other's bodies? The powerful power provided by the twin engines was now completely converted into speed and close-range combat strength under overclocking mode. That was a destructive force. The 80 cm alloy tri-edged blade drew a streak of faint purple light across the summit and stabbed viciously into the white mecha's body. Then it was pulled out, leaving behind several trails of liquid, and the impact knocked over several pieces of armor connected to the mecha's body. In overclocking mode, the Purple Sea mecha was more like a space chariot driven by a god. Its power was unstoppable, its power unmatched. Su Lu did not have the time to wipe away the fresh blood at the corner of his lips. Narrowing his eyes, he stared at the data display on his helmet, using all his strength to move the power in his body and control the simulation system to perform mecha movements one after another that even he himself could not imagine, dodging the terrifying attacks of the Purple Sea mecha. At the same time, he counted silently in his heart, 159,158. Chapter 254. The battle at the peak was completely different from the battle at the foot of the mountain, as well as the running between the mountains. Both the Purple Sea Mecha and Little White Flower no longer made any movements of flying. Instead, they clung to the ground with their mechanical legs, relying entirely on the movements of the mecha's upper body to fight. The honest here naturally meant that they had slowed down their speed by many times before they could sense it. In reality, the two MX mecha were like willow tree monsters, rooted deeply in the soil, not a trace of disorder in the slightest. Every step they took seemed so solid, but the movements of the upper half of the mecha were like willow branches dancing wildly in the wind, fast, dangerous, and terrifyingly precise. This scene gave the spectators the illusion that the mechanical legs of the two MX mecha in overclocking did not seem to move at all. Instead, it was only the ground beneath the mecha that moved. The godlike Purple Sea Mecha twisted its body, and the sharp tri-edged armor-piercing thorn slid along the surface of Little White Flower's already broken alloy mecha. The huge tri-edged thorn, nearly 1 meter long, was like a firework stick in the hands of a child. The tip of the thorn brought out a shocking spark. In the midst of the silent battle, the sawtooth blade on the right mechanical arm of the white mech silently sliced across from under the arm, leaving a shallow cut on the wrist of the Purple Sea Mech, but at least it stopped the Purple Sea Mech from delivering a fatal stab. The loud roar of the twin engines did not have air as a medium to announce its power, but it caused the body of the mecha to tremble. Under the effect of the peak power, the Purple Sea Mecha retracted its mechanical leg, and like a gust of wind, it forced its way into the midsection of Little White Flower's mecha, its shoulder slamming into the midsection of the cockpit. For a moment, broken pieces of the shock-absorbing armor flew everywhere. A chilling distortion slowly appeared, and the white mecha slumped, about to fall 147. Su Lu ignored the bloodstains on his chest, silently counting down in his heart. The weight of high speed was already a heavy enough burden for a pilot. After entering overclocking mode, Little White Flower's mecha could no longer provide a complete shock-absorbing and life support system like before when it faced the violent attack of the Purple Sea head-on. The tremendous impact caused his iron-like body to feel sore and painful, as if it was about to fall apart. Su Lu didn't know how many mouthfuls of blood he had spat out. His face was a little pale as he stared at the holographic screen in his helmet. His hands moved quickly, and the joysticks made cracking sounds as if they were about to break. Every inch of his skin was burning as he sent instructions to the simulation system. Controlling Little White Flower to block Purple Sea's fierce thrust, but it was unable to block Purple Sea's powerful strike. As the surface of the mech changed shape, Su Li's vision turned black for a moment from the tremendous force. From the warning data of the onboard computer, he knew that Little White Flower had lost its balance. With a muffled grunt, Su Li's body, which was wrapped in the simulation system, began to tremble rapidly. Countless complex commands were transmitted to every component of the mecha. The thick and heavy mechanical legs began to tremble and slide. They began to move in a semi-closed arc around a certain fixed point. The high-speed hydraulic pipelines and transmission devices in the armor pressed, stretched, and returned to their original positions at a speed that could not be seen with the naked eye. During this process, the terrifying impact of the Purple Sea's mecha was gradually dispelled. Little White Flower's mecha looked like it was on the brink of death, but in the end, it stood proudly at the end of the two deep trenches. Can't fall. Su Lu flicked the 5 fingers of his right hand. Cooperating with the simulation system, he controlled Little White Flower's mecha to stick close to the platform on the peak and charged towards the Purple Sea once more. After entering overclocking mode, both Su Lu and Mad Manly no longer used the fierce leaping attack moves they had done at the foot of the mountain. Instead, with great tacit understanding, they had their mecha cling tightly to the weathered rocks on the peak as they advanced. Their horizontal movement speed increased slightly, but neither attempted to attack from the air. Overclocking battle was an extremely risky battle mode. From the very beginning, Su Lu had acted on instinct and operated his mecha according to the 10 stances Uncle Feng Yu had taught him. He was not willing to let Little White Flower leave the ground for even a microsecond. Those 10 mysterious and strange stances were all powerful body techniques that allowed one to stand tall on the ground and remain as still as a pine tree. He did not quite understand why the Purple Sea's mecha would also choose this type of battle mode. Could it be that Uncle Feng was really related to the Lees of Philadelphia in some way? Su Lu could vaguely grasp the Purple Sea's mecha's battle style and attack patterns. Linking it to that night in Linyuan, he even had a feeling that the 10 stances Uncle Feng had taught him seemed to be some kind of secret technique to counter the Lees of Philadelphia. However, Madman Li was still Madman Li after all. It was no wonder he was known as the invincible fighter in the military. It was no wonder he was the super strong fighter who had continuously hunted down the Empire's Royal Mecha Battalion for more than 3 years. Even if Su Lu used the simulation system to control his mecha, which was equivalent to the hand speed of a military ace pilot, and even if he could vaguely guess the attack rhythm and direction of the Purple Sea's mecha, he could not find any chance to retaliate in front of the purple torrent that filled the peak of the mountain. Previously, at the foot of the mountain, the Purple Sea's mecha had displayed mobility and crazy attack ability, and Madman Li's hands had already made Su Lu feel that it was difficult to withstand. However, after entering overclocking mode, the Purple Sea's mecha became even more terrifying in close combat. Firstly, the super performance of the Purple Sea after overclocking was fully displayed. Secondly, Li Feng, who was controlling the Purple Sea, seemed to really be a little crazy. In the vision of Su Li's helmet, on the holographic screen of the Old Moon base and the ground command hall, everyone seemed to vaguely see a roaring purple spotted tiger. It was currently charging towards the platform on the peak of the Khaki Peak on the moon's polar region, towards the white mecha that refused to admit defeat no matter what. It was launching its final bite. The white mecha flashed and dodged at high speed. Time and time again, in contact, collision, sword light, and shadow of punches, the white mecha was knocked back and injured. Inside the mecha, Su Lu kept staring with his pair of small eyes, silently counting down in his heart, 132,131. At this moment, Su Lu, who was inside the little white flower mecha, was not squinting his eyes like before. Instead, he was staring with wide eyes at the Purple Sea mecha in his vision. In the Purple Sea, Li Feng, on the other hand, was skillfully operating the mecha, launching wave after wave of powerful attacks. At the same time, he was squinting his eyes to size up the white mecha that was in a terrible state. Its performance had dropped drastically, but it still refused to admit defeat. For this young genius pilot from the Federation, mecha battles had long become a part of his life. It was an exciting factor in his blood. This kind of intense battle should not have made him enter such a violent and wild state. However, that despicable person in the white mecha unexpectedly made him develop such a strong desire to battle. Li Feng admitted that Su Lu had surprised him. Not only did Su Lu personally operate the mecha to battle with him, but also the standard that Su Lu had displayed in this battle. This was already close to the standard of an ace pilot in the army. Moreover, he knew that Su Lu was the technician who had developed the Nutshell MX, so in terms of operating the new MX, he had a great advantage. However, he still did not think that Su Lu would be able to defeat him. This was a kind of pride and confidence that was deeply rooted in his bones. The Purple Sea's excellent maneuverability perfectly displayed the standard of his mecha operation. The Purple Sea's current ferocious attacks were like a raging river. In fact, he could do it with his eyes closed. When Li Feng was still a baby and had just opened his eyes, that grandfather of his had carried him into the mecha. Not long after he had learned how to walk, his grandfather had started to let him try to climb the ladder beside the tall mecha. Other than his grandfather, the first word that Li Feng had learned was mecha. Before he had learned how to drive a car, he had already learned how to operate a mecha. Before he had time to like girls, such as Yuzi, he had already fallen in love with the feeling of operating a mecha. When all the youths in the Federation were still looking at the teaching screens and imagining the mecha levels in online games, the 12-year-old Li Feng had already been sent to the front lines of the West Woods by his grandfather. He had passed the unprecedented military test and obtained his first real military mecha. Then, he had begun to operate the M52 on the mineral planets, on the pirate ships. He had learned how to slaughter, and had gotten used to smashing the enemy's mecha into a pile of scrap metal. In the short 16 years of Madman Li's life, he had always been closely associated with the term mecha, never separating from it. Sometimes, he even felt that every time he stayed in the stuffy and quiet cockpit, he was his true self. Invincible in the military, Madman Li, these were all adjectives he had gotten from operating a mecha. This was because the moment he entered a mecha, he would be even wilder and more violent than usual. This was because he was even stronger in a mecha. Thus, Li Feng could not understand why Su Le had been able to hold on for so long. Why did he not admit defeat even though he knew that defeat was certain and could only be worse? Thinking of that bet, and the white mecha's persistence at this moment, Madman Li's eyes narrowed even more. A hint of anger flashed through his reddish eyes. The purple sea mecha attacked fiercely once again, ravaging the little white flower over and over again. There was no such thing as mutual appreciation. The pale-faced Sulu stared with wide eyes amidst the intense tremors. He stared at that purple sea which was like a mad tiger, controlling his mecha to avoid those fatal points of attack as he mumbled softly to himself, "Fuck you, fuck you." His voice was so gentle, so calm that even he himself felt that he was still calm. He did not feel the intimidating power and aura displayed by the purple sea mecha before him. However, his rationality told him that whether it was in terms of mecha operation accuracy, battle experience, or any of the qualities and abilities required to operate a mecha, Li Feng was far above him in all aspects. If this had not been a secret military test match, Sulu knew that Madman Li would definitely not mind killing him after defeating him. Thus, there was no such thing as mutual appreciation. He only stared coldly, wanting to see how the other would die. The countdown in his heart had already reached 1,117 seconds. 1 minute had passed, so there were still more than 2 minutes left. Sulu did not know if he could hold on for more than 2 minutes. He did not know if the little white flower's mecha would explode prematurely. After entering overclocking, the battle was even more one-sided. The white mecha was in an extremely wretched state, looking like it could explode at any moment. However, Sulu had no intention of surrendering. He only made each of his operations more precise, each of his dodges faster, each of his attacks fiercer. On the quiet platform of Kaki Peak, the purple sea mech was like an invincible god, while the white mech was like a trembling little white flower. Occasionally, it would be blown away by the wind or crushed by the giant's feet. There were several parts of the mech's body that were bent out of shape. Liquid leaked out, and the central control system was damaged. It could collapse at any moment. But it did not collapse. The people in the ground command hall watched the images on the screen in silence. The neutral military mechanics and engineers watched this scene quietly. A sense of respect for the successor of the military god grew in their hearts, as well as respect for the nutshell mecha operator. On the other hand, the staff in the nutshell area were clenching their fists nervously. Looking at the tragic sight of the little white flower on the screen, all of them had the urge to admit defeat. Shang Qiu's eyes had already turned into the moon's. She stared blankly at the screen. She knew that the little white flower's mecha was not willing to admit defeat. It was persevering, wanting to hold on until that moment arrived. But the problem was, looking at the data being fed back at this moment, the little white flower's mecha would not be able to hold on until that moment, it would be in danger of exploding. As the technical supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department, she did not have the authority to stop this test. But subtly, she suddenly really hoped that Su Lu would admit defeat, because this way, at least he would be able to preserve his own life. There was nervousness, there was respect, and naturally there were other emotions as well. Not everyone would cast a respectful gaze towards a persevering loser. The professors and experts from the Federal Academy of Science were already smiling calmly and confidently as they watched the screen at the top of Kaki Peak. From their perspective, the standards of the Federation's new MX mecha would definitely be the glory that belonged to them. On the viewing platform, Dean Lin Yuanhu no longer leaned forward. He stroked the white hair at the corner of his forehead and sat back down in his chair. Turning his head, he whispered a few words to the national security advisor beside him. There were not many people in the Old Moon base who had the authority to watch this mecha test battle, but there were still more than 100 people. They were all soldiers of the Federation, so naturally, they would stand on the side of the heir of the military god who was operating the Purple Sea mecha. Just like the people from the Academy of Science in the Ground Command Hall, they too had relaxed smiles on their faces. It was just that the people in the military base were more direct in their reactions. Some of them began to cheer, while others even began to count. These military officers thought back to the bet that the technical supervisor of Nutshell had made with Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng 2 days ago. They thought back to the young man's disrespect towards the military god of Philadelphia. Right now, watching the Purple Sea mecha tormenting the little white flower in a frenzy, their emotions were stirred to the extreme. 1, 2, 3. They were counting. How many more seconds would it take for the Purple Sea mecha to defeat that white mecha? They were even wondering if they should immediately go and drag the technical supervisor of Nutshell out so that he could fulfill his end of the bet and kneel down before the Lees of Philadelphia. Chapter 255. Looks like your Shell Motor Company is indeed not popular. The MX mecha will be allocated to soldiers in the future, but look at the attitude of the military. They are clearly only willing to accept the Purple Sea. What are you all fighting for? In a room on the second floor of the Old Moon Base's observation hall, the official from the Constitutional Bureau rubbed his throbbing abdomen as he looked at Bai Yulan, who had her head lowered in silence, and sneered. He didn't know that those soldiers were so fanatically supporting the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea mecha because of the Lees of Philadelphia. The soldiers in the base had followed the request of the Bureau of Proclamation. After arresting Bai Yulan, they had actually kept him locked up in the base. This matter involved the Federation's MX mecha test. No matter how detached the Bureau of Proclamation was from the political structure of the Federation, they couldn't immediately do anything to Bai Yulan. Besides, there were still many things hidden behind this matter. Since that official had already fulfilled the request of some power and kept the pilot that Nutshell had originally arranged to stay, he naturally didn't want to cause any more trouble. Bai Yulan slowly raised his head and quietly looked through the glass door of the room at the breathtaking MX mecha battle on the screen. He was silent for a long time. He thought to himself that if he was the one controlling Little White Flower now, he might have been able to complete it better than Su Lu in the beginning. However, right now, under the violent attacks of the Purple Sea, he definitely wouldn't be willing to hold on like this. 8. 9. What are you saying? The official from the Bureau of Proclamation looked at him coldly. Bai Yulan turned his head and said softly, I'm counting. How long will it take for the Purple Sea mecha from the Academy of Science to explode? He paused for a moment, then continued softly, now it seems that I really have to thank you for locking me up. Otherwise, how could that guy be angry enough to personally go into battle? The face of the official from the Bureau of Proclamation darkened slightly. He didn't say anything else. He turned his head to look at the MX battle that he was also very interested in. He thought to himself that this delicate man was probably mad to the point of insanity. Otherwise, why would he say such a thing? Some people participated in the Federation's extreme long-distance race, but in the end, their legs were crippled and their bodies were exhausted. However, they still stubbornly shook off the hands of the medical staff and limped towards the finish line, ignoring whether there were still spectators around them. Su Lu respected these men with sportsmanship, but he would not do that. He didn't want to cause trouble, wasn't afraid of trouble, and didn't want to attract attention. But if he was running on the track and people in the same race tried to trip him or use tricks, then he would keep running until he overtook them and won the championship. Then he would turn around coldly, look at those people, ask why, reason with them, and fight for his dignity. This guy was not afraid when someone pointed a cold gun at his head in the Donglin district. He was only angry. When he encountered an iron fist, he did not cower. Instead, he bravely escaped. He did not leave timidly. Instead, he went to find Feng Yu. This guy was not afraid when he saw the black mecha in the underground parking lot. Instead, he kicked it fiercely. When he was bullied by important people, he did not back down. Instead, he stood up bravely. He did not use the data to try to get anything. Instead, he stood there silently, waiting for reason and fairness. He stood there until now. The little white flower's mecha was in a sorry state. It was miserable. It could explode at any time, but he refused to admit defeat. Perhaps even he himself did not understand when this stubbornness, which seemed to have faded from his life as a young miner, had returned to his body. He did not think of Uncle Fengyu. He did not think of the innocent waitresses who died in the Linhai State Stadium. He did not think of Zhang Xiaomeng who died in a political conspiracy. He did not think of Shi Qinghai who was betrayed and disappeared. He did not think of Professor Shen in the Galaxy Public Cemetery. He did not think of the old professor's hard work in the experiment data. He did not think of the officer surnamed Park on Hushan Road. He did not think of the broken bodies at the concert in Huanshan Mountain. He did not think of the independent director in the rainy night. He did not think of Magnolia who was arrested by the Bureau of Proclamation 2 days ago. Because there was no need to think of these. They were all buried deep in his mind. From Donglin to S1, the unfairness, darkness, and conspiracy of the Federation had always been there. Sulu often thought of the letter Shi Qinghai left for him before he left. In the face of social injustice, some people wanted to be the ones to inflict it. Some people silently accepted it. Some people wanted to change something. Those without power would shout on the internet, using silence to express their anger. And what should those with power do? MX Mecha, the Academy of Science, Politics, the election, Sulu had already unconsciously become a person with power. He could change some things, so he told himself that he must persevere. Each time the little white flower suffered a heavy blow, it was like a sledgehammer striking a rock. This rock persevered, but who knew whether the rock would shatter in the end? Or the sledgehammer would shatter? Or would the people in the Federation who wielded the sledgehammer be afraid and tired? Sulu stared with red eyes at the crazed silhouette of the purple sea mecha in his field of vision, but he was unusually calm as he carried out his own operations. The little white flower mecha could not hold on for much longer, but he was becoming more and more familiar with the controls, feeling stronger and stronger. Those 10 poses that Uncle Fengyu had taught him back then were all perfectly executed by him using the little white flower mecha. His eyes were red. Naturally, it was not because he was moved or sad, but because there was fire, a very big fire. Sulu stared at that terrifying purple sea mecha, thinking of that arrogant and unreasonable person inside the mecha. When we first met at Linyuan, you wanted to kill me. When we met at the hospital, you said you wanted to kill me again. Today, when we met again at the peak of Old Moon Peak, you still wanted to kill me. Although you have never really killed me, what right do you have to say this so calmly? You are the only grandson of the Federation's military god. You are a rare genius pilot. You joined the army at the age of 12 to kill the enemy, and you have already become a legend. So you want to proudly say that one day you will kill me? I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I have already killed when I was 10. Today, I want to beat you up, and then make you call me uncle. 98, 97. 63, 61. 38, 37, Sulu and Shang Qiu had repeatedly calculated many times. The electronic jets that the Purple Sea Mecha had designed based on that deviated functional model could only last for 3 minutes because the dual-engine mecha needed to adjust its posture while in overclocking mode. In the past, in his mind, 3 minutes was a very short amount of time. But today, he found that these 180 seconds were actually as long as space travel and unbearable. There were still 37 seconds left, but the little white flower mecha was already at its most dangerous edge. Sulu silently operated his mecha to make an attack motion, but he knew that even if he did not accept it, he was going to lose today. However, right at this moment, the Purple Sea Mecha, which had been as crazy as a drunken tiger, with an overwhelming presence, and had the absolute advantage all this while, suddenly seemed somewhat uncoordinated as it executed a standard left-spinning sideways attack motion. In the next instant, the Purple Sea Mecha's beautiful back armor vibrated. On the giant holographic screen in the ground command hall, many of the technical parameters belonging to Mecha Number 1 were performing perfectly. Even in overclocking mode, they were still very stable. In contrast, on the other side, Mecha Number 2's technical parameters were already somewhat horrible to look at. No one knew how that nutshell pilot could still operate a mecha that was about to be scrapped. However, right at this moment, the light beam representing the most important power output indicator of Mecha Number 1 abruptly stopped moving up and down within the normal range, coming to a standstill at a certain level. Then, the power output light beam fell abruptly, rushing towards its original position. The red light beam fell abruptly. It looked like blood loss. It was a ghastly sight. No one in the entire command hall could react. Even Nutshell and the other engineers could only stare blankly at the holographic screen, thinking that their eyes were playing tricks on them. However, Shang Qiu, who had been nervous for a long time, reacted faster than anyone else. She raised her right hand high into the air and clenched it into a fist. In her fist was a pen. She shouted excitedly, "Fuck!" The profanity of this genius female engineer woke up many people in the command hall. As if someone was commanding them, the engineers, experts, and professors of the three factions all let out cries of surprise at the same time. Combined together, it was like a giant wave, flooding the entire command hall. In the stands, Lin Yuanhu, who had been quietly chatting with the National Security Advisor, had not looked at the monotonous and one-sided battle on the holographic screen in order to show his confidence to the people of the Federation. He indeed had absolute confidence in both Purple Sea and Madman Li, especially after overclocking mode. So, when he heard the cries of surprise, he could not help but be a little surprised. Dean Lin Yuanhu turned his head and saw that the power output indicator on the holographic screen had already fallen to 0. He stood up abruptly, his aged lips becoming incomparably pale. His body swayed twice. He clutched his left chest, as if he could collapse at any moment. The soldiers in the old moon base had already counted to 70. They thought that Purple Sea's mecha was already in the bag and that perhaps the nutshell white mecha would explode in the next moment. Bai Yulan had already stood up and was standing behind the door. She looked at the holographic screen with slight anxiety. She had already counted to 37 seconds, but it seemed that she could no longer see the possibility of what would happen next. Right at this moment, the sound of the old moon base counting suddenly stopped abruptly. Everyone looked at the holographic screen in confusion. They did not understand why the Purple Sea mecha's originally incomparably sharp left-turn footwork had become somewhat sluggish. Moreover, the sluggishness was a little too much. It's probably the image being delayed, some people thought in their hearts. Maybe he wants to leave the nutshell mecha to play with for a while longer. Some people thought of Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng's movements. What happened next made the speculations of all the old moon base officers become a joke. On the platform at the peak of Mount Kaki, the Purple Sea mecha had not even finished its sluggish left-turn footwork when the struggling white mecha suddenly moved violently. This naturally could not be the result of the image being delayed. In the moment when the Purple Sea mecha was on the brink of dissatisfaction and struggle, every abnormality in its movements was like a provocative signal that entered Su Li's brain through his eyes. However, in the previous long period of time, Madman Li had controlled the Purple Sea mecha with a sense of indifference in its madness. There had been no loopholes that could be exploited. However, at this moment, the beautiful left-turn footwork of the Purple Sea mecha had a problem. For Su Lu, who had been waiting bitterly for more than 100 seconds, this anomaly undoubtedly represented his best chance. Although he did not understand why the Purple Sea mecha's problem had occurred 37 seconds earlier than he had predicted, he knew that he had to grab hold of this opportunity. In reality, Su Lu needed to exert any kind of mental pressure on himself to make the final explosive strike. This was because, like a spring that had been suppressed for a long time, if it did not lose its elasticity due to metal fatigue and adhesion, once it got the chance, it would definitely rebound strongly. Or, like a drowning person, once they grabbed hold of something by their side, they would definitely not let go. Through this series of brutal blows, Sulu had gradually come to understand how to use the simulation system to replicate the 10 poses that the uncle had taught him with his mecha. However, Little White Flower's mecha was severely damaged, and Crazy Lee was putting too much pressure on him. His attacks were too ferocious, so there was no chance for him to put it into practice. At this time, the Purple Sea mecha suddenly changed. The heavy pressure on Mount Kaki loosened, and Little White Flower's mecha, which had been teetering on the brink of collapse, suddenly displayed absolute speed. It turned into a flowing shadow, evading the triangular alloy spike on the right mechanical arm of the Purple Sea mecha. The white mecha's thick mechanical legs seemed to be trembling, but in reality, it was moving quickly, sticking close to the ground. In an instant, it twisted its body to stand face to face with the Purple Sea mecha. The serrated blade at the front of the mechanical arm chopped down viciously at the neck of the Purple Sea mecha, sending sparks flying. Immediately after that, Little White Flower's mecha swaggered up, charging straight for the middle of the Purple Sea mecha's abdomen. At the same time, its left mechanical arm wrapped around the Purple Sea mecha's head, and the battered Little White Flower lowered its head, slamming viciously into the assembled armor beside the Purple Sea mecha's cockpit. Sparks flew everywhere, smoke and dust flew everywhere. The white light was blinding, and the mecha warped and twisted. There was mist and blood-like liquid leaking out. Little White Flower's mecha and the Purple Sea mecha continued to maintain this stance that in today's MX battle, Madman Lee's Purple Sea mecha had been extremely domineering. However, Su Lee's Little White Flower mecha had been able to push its performance to the limits despite being at an extreme disadvantage. The situation had looked tragic, but it had successfully evaded most of the fatal attacks, which was why Little White Flower had been able to hold on until the very last moment. However, at this time, Little White Flower's sudden burst of 3 consecutive attacks had truly hit the Purple Sea's vital points. Whether it was the connecting part of the mecha's skull or the assembled armor beside the cockpit, after suffering such heavy damage, how could it still stand? Chapter 256. Little White Flower's final 3 consecutive attacks looked simple, but in reality, it was the most perfect attack that Su Lu could execute while operating the damaged mecha. Each of Little White Flower's seemingly normal attacks were in fact continuous, avoiding Purple Sea's attacks after losing power and still relying on inertia to maintain high speed, successfully dealing heavy damage to the opponent. This was a combination of 3 of the 10 stances that Feng Yu had taught Su Lu, and it was executed by Little White Flower's mecha in an instant. The high-speed chain blade at the front of the mechanical arm was pulled out of Purple Sea's mecha, leaving behind a trail of sparks as it drew a tragic wound. This action was very fast, but it looked exceptionally slow. Having lost power, Purple Sea's mecha seemed to have no power left to fight back, but Little White Flower did not stop there. The mecha moved at high speed, and within a second, it turned into countless white lines on the peak of Kaki Peak, continuously attacking Purple Sea. The tips of those white lines were dyed black, appearing dark and sinister. The countless lines converged on the body of Purple Sea's mecha, finally converging into a single point, and violently releasing a burst of power. This scene fell into the eyes of the people watching the battle in the command hall of the Old Moon base. They all felt their scalps go numb. This was a military test battle, and the nutshell operator controlling Little White Flower's mecha actually did not stop, as if he was hell-bent on destroying the opponent's mecha. This method was a little too ruthless. The peak of Kaki Peak trembled. The vacuum space that had been silent for hundreds of millions of years seemed to be about to be distorted by Little White Flower's final ruthless attacks. Little White Flower's mecha was like a cold-blooded monster, continuously executing high-speed attack moves. That was because Su Lu, who was operating the mecha, knew very well what kind of monster Madman Lee was in Purple Sea. Moreover, Purple Sea's twin engines had exploded more than 10 seconds earlier than expected. What was the reason for this? He needed to coldly and completely defeat Purple Sea, not giving the opponent any chance to escape. This was only the calculations of the silent engineer, but on the screen, Little White Flower appeared very ferocious at this moment. Following the final inertia of the Purple Sea mecha, the sharp and hard alloy stiletto about 1 meter long stabbed viciously into the left mechanical leg of the Little White Flower mecha with the last bit of power remaining in the microengine channels of the various joints. The heavily injured Little White Flower's left mechanical arm snapped like a spring that had been suppressed for too long. Finally, it could no longer withstand anything. This was Purple Sea's final attack that Sulu had always been wary of. Little White Flower's mecha's high-speed fanged blades stabbed over viciously. Just like the disciples of the pugilistic world who had thrown themselves into the shadows of the city's forest, without thinking twice, the blade broke through the armor and stabbed deeply in. Then, there was true silence. Little White Flower's mecha's left mechanical leg splashed with sparks. Liquid sprayed onto the white mountaintop rocks, unable to support the heavy body of the mecha anymore. It looked like a crippled warrior, only able to rely on the front end of the mechanical arm for support. 2 meters in front of him, Purple Sea's mecha suddenly shuddered, and then fell to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. In the last moment, the powerful Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had still managed to remove one of Little White Flower's left mechanical legs, but Little White Flower had damaged Purple Sea's entire system. Right now, Purple Sea's dual-core engines had already exploded, and the power of the joint microengines had dissipated. It was already a dead object. Watching the other build a mecha that was as tall as a building, watching this mecha collapse, right under the smoke and dust of Kaki Peak. In the stuffy cockpit, Sulu slowly pushed off his helmet. He breathed heavily and hurriedly, wiping away the blood at the corner of his mouth. Looking at Purple Sea's mecha that was like a pile of scrap metal not too far away, he knew that the opponent no longer had any combat power. Only then did he truly relax and not continue to pursue. A faint trace of excitement and frustration welled up in his heart, but Sulu did not feel the slightest bit of pride. He narrowed his eyes and stared blankly at Purple Sea's mecha on the ground, endless exhaustion welling up in his heart. Madman Li had not been defeated by him. It was just that Purple Sea had been defeated by Little White Flower. As a pilot, he did not have any sense of accomplishment with which to boast about himself. The onboard computer of Little White Flower's mecha began to sound an alarm. The assembly system was already on the verge of collapse. The gravity of the old moon was much smaller than that of the S1 mecha, but the previously incomparably powerful and seemingly invincible Purple Sea's mecha collapsed with a crash into the weathered rocks, shaking up a cloud of dust on the ground. It appeared exceptionally heavy. Everyone who saw this scene felt as if their hearts had been ruthlessly smashed by a heavy stone. Purple Sea's mecha collapsed on the mountaintop. In the cockpit, Li Feng slowly pushed off his helmet and then lay motionless on his back. Through the visual system, he looked at the starry sky above his head. For a very long time, he did not speak or move. He only remained silent. Purple Sea's mecha had been continuously damaged in the end. Its engine had exploded, and it was already a pile of trash. The last life support system was also beginning to gradually lose its function. Danger was approaching, but Madman Li did not seem to care at all. In the previous battle, Purple Sea had always held the advantage in terms of attack. His body had not suffered any injuries. A strange expression flashed across that delicate face. His thin lips moved slightly, and he muttered to himself, "Fuck." The sound of counting in the old moon base came to an abrupt halt the moment Purple Sea's mecha had a problem. The scene that had happened in reality made those Federation soldiers who were proud of Philadelphia's military god feel incredulous. The people in the hall stared at the holographic screen. Seeing Little White Flower's last series of vicious attacks, their expressions were abnormally shocked. When the last purple mecha suddenly and decisively fell to the ground, while Little White Flower's mecha was still dragging a broken mechanical leg and barely standing up, the old moon base became even quieter, a deathly silence. Then, almost at the same time, there was a burst of exclamations and curses. "Fuck!" In the room upstairs, Magnolia shook her head. She glanced at the extremely ugly expression of the Bureau of Proclamation official beside her. The fist in her pocket clenched tightly, and she let out a muffled breath. The ground command hall was even more lively. No one could accept this result in a short time, including the expert engineers from the Nutshell Engineering Department. Purple Sea's mecha from the Academy of Science was clearly about to obtain a decisive victory, but in the end, it had exploded. In the previous parameter curves, there were no signs of danger at all. What was going on? Fuck. Although the technicians from the Nutshell Engineering Department couldn't understand, seeing their company's little white flower obtain the final victory, they were already jumping up and down in excitement. They clapped and cheered with each other, using vulgarities to vent their excitement and nervousness. Shang Qiu was one of the few people who could foresee today's situation. When the Purple Sea's power output had abruptly decreased, she had already involuntarily cursed. Now, however, she was able to stabilize her emotions. A happy smile appeared on her clean face. Although she knew from the very beginning that the Purple Sea mecha was the biggest hidden danger, Madman Li's suppressive fighting style had successfully dealt a heavy blow to Little White Flower. She had been worried for so long, and now she could finally relax. Subconsciously, Shang Qiu turned around to look. She wanted to see the expressions of the professors from the Academy of Science and Director Lin Yuanhu. Although the mechanics and engineers of the Federal Military General Assembly Base were also abnormally surprised that the successor of the war god would lose this battle, they still woke up a little faster than the two parties involved. They had already begun the follow-up procedures. They were just thinking in their hearts. The excellent performance of the Purple Sea mecha had actually been destroyed in the last second. What was the reason? The professors and experts of the Federal Academy of Science were looking at the screen with desolate expressions. They looked at the two mecha that had already entered the recycling procedures. They had put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears for that purple MX. Now, they could only watch helplessly as it was defeated. No one could understand why the engine had malfunctioned. That kind of feeling of defeat mixed with the confusion of the unknown made their expressions incomparably gloomy. Shang Qiu looked at these images, and a sweet and satisfied smile bloomed on her lips. However, she immediately noticed that Director Lin Yuanhu, who had originally been stunned, had now calmly returned to his seat. Her heart couldn't help but skip a beat. The important figures of the Federation government and military in the stands were all shocked by the sudden turn of events at the peak of Kaki Mountain. They all stood up, hands on the railings in front of them, and looked at the screen in shock. Occasionally, they would lower their heads and whisper something to the people around them. Just as they were about to sit down, the sound of footsteps came from the entrance of the command hall. The president of the Federation, Mr. Sieg, had finally finished an important meeting and hurried over. However, the battle was already over. Everyone stood up and saluted the president. Shang Qiu, however, noticed Supervisor Jose who had walked in with the president. She narrowed her eyes. She couldn't help but feel that there was some hidden meaning in Supervisor Jose's gaze. The battle at the peak of Kaki Mountain had already ended. The Federation's near-space fleet was currently completing the recovery procedures. The images on the giant holographic screen had already been replaced by a continuous flow of various technical data comparisons. The soldiers at the old moon base who had watched the battle had already left, cursing and swearing. The two pilots who had personally participated in the battle were currently receiving treatment. Meanwhile, there was still a lot of work to be done in the ground command hall. These tasks were even more important than the battle itself. While the preparation procedures for the data calibration were being carried out, the command hall was temporarily much quieter. Many people began to rest, drinking coffee, and trying to soothe their previously tense emotions. In a small conference room at the side of the command hall, President Sieg sat in the middle seat. He lowered his head and looked at the battle report presented by his subordinates. He hadn't made a final decision regarding the battle test and the Federation's new mecha standards. Using the battle method, which was too direct, so much so that it was almost like child's play, to determine the Federation's new MX mecha standards was a suggestion made by that old man in Philadelphia. That old man could basically influence the attitude of the entire federal military. Therefore, logically speaking, the results of the battle at the peak of Khaki Mountain should be able to determine who the standards belonged to. However, it was clear that some people weren't willing to admit their failure. All the technical parameters show that the Purple Sea mecha developed by the Federal Academy of Science has an incomparable advantage in the aspect of nutshell. The National Security Advisor frowned. He knew that it wasn't a good choice for him to speak up first. However, the development of the situation was completely out of his expectations. For the sake of his political future, he could only go against the president's hint and continue to stand on the side of the Academy of Science. The president's science advisor looked at him in disbelief. He didn't understand that the truth was right in front of him. The Purple Sea mecha had only entered overclocking mode for 2 minutes before exploding. How could the Federation use such a standard? Why was the National Security Advisor so insistent? The truth is very clear, the science advisor said, somewhat annoyed. In the end, it was the Purple Sea mecha that exploded. What else is there to say? The Federation's new mecha standards should, of course, use the nutshell standards. The National Security Advisor shook his head and said, a new standard is not a small matter. How can it be decided with just one battle? It should be considered comprehensively. The Purple Sea's high performance is obviously more useful to the federal military. You're being unreasonable. The science advisor couldn't be bothered to argue with this person about stability. He said directly, then what's the point of arranging this battle today? President Sieg suddenly raised his head and glanced at Lin Yuanhu. He said calmly, Director, do you have any opinion? Lin Yuanhu's hands, which were covered in age spots, rested calmly on the table. After a moment of silence, he said, under normal battle conditions, the Purple Sea has the absolute advantage. Overclocking mode is unstable to begin with, and this is just a test model. Even if the problem with the Purple Sea mecha today was not a coincidence, it can always be improved. President Sieg's expression did not change, but his mood became somewhat irritated. He glanced coldly at Lin Yuanhu. If this old director of the Academy of Science had not said anything, perhaps his opinion of this person would have improved. Lin Yuanhu seemed to not sense the president's gaze. He lowered his eyes and said slowly in an old voice, overclocking is a rare situation. The federal military is equipped with standard mecha. I don't think it's appropriate to use such a rare situation as a standard background comparison. This reason seemed to make a lot of sense. If it was a normal battle with 2 engines and 4 times the power output, the superior performance of the Purple Sea mecha would indeed be extremely outstanding. However, at this moment, another voice rang out in the conference room. General Miles said slowly, I don't agree with Dean Lin's opinion. It will be very common for the new mecha to enter overclocking mode in the future. The Federation's Minister of Defense was hospitalized due to illness. Meanwhile, Zhou Yingxing, who was in charge of the department's work, could not directly participate in the discussion at the highest level due to the collective actions of certain powers. At this moment, in the small conference room, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and commander of the 1st Military Region, General Miles, was undoubtedly the absolute representative of the military. Chapter 257. In the battle for the standards of the MX mecha, General Miles, as one of the most important figures in the military, had once leaned towards the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea mecha. On one hand, he had been influenced by certain people, and on the other hand, he respected Director Lin Yuanhu. Having been in the military for decades, he knew better than anyone how much the Federal Academy of Science had contributed to the Federal Army. In fact, it was not just him. That 3-star female General Heng Yuliang, who was cruising in space, had leaned towards the standards of the Academy of Science in the beginning for this reason. However, the Federal Army was loyal to the Federation and the representative of the Federation, Mr. President. The excellent traditions of the past many years allowed this iron-like army to not lose its way amidst the prosperity of interstellar space. These military bigwigs, when faced with a major issue that involved the combat power of the Federal Army, would immediately abandon their former personal standpoints and completely stand from the perspective of the Federation to consider the problem. The results of today's battle were already out. The words of director Lin Yuan, who earlier had made President Sieg very dissatisfied, and a trace of displeasure had also surged in General Miles's heart. How difficult was it for the federal military to cultivate an excellent pilot? Did they have to let the military pilot that purple sea which could explode at any time? Even Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had lost to an engine explosion, let alone other pilots. Therefore, when director Lin Yuanhu felt that the new MX mecha's overclocked state was rare and could not be used to compare the strengths of the two mecha, he had to stand up and say something. As the number one figure in the military in the present conference room, his words carried a lot of weight. And to a certain extent, he also represented the military's opinion on this battle. Mr. President has been personally paying attention to the development of the new MX mecha. General Miles looked around coldly and explained, the reason for this is actually very clear to everyone in the conference room right now. That is because of the information received from the Empire. The Empire's development of the new mecha has already begun, and they have made a breakthrough. As for what level of breakthrough, we have no way of knowing. Everyone has seen today's battle. Under the support of the new MX mecha's super maneuverability, the mecha's self-contained long-range firepower system has been greatly reduced. As long as the enemy is unable to concentrate their firepower in a short period of time. An MX mech is a great gun that can penetrate the enemy's formation and engage in difficult battles. Whether it is the Federation or the Empire, if they want to prevent the enemy's new mecha from launching a surprise attack in a complicated environment and a low-intensity electronic surveillance battlefield, there is only one way to do so. General Miles solemnly extended a finger and said in a heavy tone, use a new mecha against a new mecha, and it's close combat. I'm not used to underestimating the Federation's enemies. We can assume that the Empire's new mecha are similar to the Federation's MX in terms of performance, and that they were developed at about the same time. In that case, the new mecha's close combat capabilities will be an important factor in influencing the situation on the battlefield. General Miles frowned and stopped the National Security Advisor from interrupting. He continued, we all know that overclocking combat is not a stable special state. In a normal battle, no pilot would be willing to enter this state. However, the problem is that the battle of the new mecha is close combat. If you want to kill the enemy and not be killed by the enemy, you can only enter the overclocking combat state. Overclocking is very dangerous. Those barbaric bastards in the Imperial Royal Mecha camp only have melodramatic thoughts of dying for a just cause. Would they be afraid of this kind of danger? Of course they wouldn't be afraid. Then what about us? Even if the pilots of the Federal Army are afraid, they can only not be afraid. Because if they are afraid, they will die. That's why I said that in future planetary surface battles, the new mecha's overclocking combat will be the norm. General Miles glanced at Director Lin Yuanhu and said slowly, the stability of the mecha in the overclocking state is the most urgent requirement of the federal military. Performance is very important, but stability is even more important. The military has always followed this standard when purchasing. We will never let our own young people take this kind of risk. General Miles's speech was very brief, but the people in the conference room were all experienced people. They naturally understood what he meant. The battle between the Federation and the Empire would be a battle of the new mecha against the new mecha. Under this kind of situation, if the Federation pilots were to operate a mecha that would explode in less than 3 minutes after entering the overclocking state, how would they have any chance of winning? Lin Yuanhu's calm face looked even older. The emotions that he had forcefully suppressed earlier, because of the federal military's stance, began to wreak havoc in his withered body again. He subconsciously pressed lightly on the left side of his chest. After a long silence, he said, the stability problem is not unsolvable. The problem can only be solved when the problem is discovered. With the excellent performance of the Purple Sea, if this problem can be solved, it will also give the outstanding young people of the Federation a greater advantage on the battlefield in the future. Listen to the technical report first. President Sieg rudely interrupted Lin Yuanhu's explanation. He did not give any face to this Federation academic leader and walked out of the conference room directly. Outside the conference room, the deputy director of the Office of the President's Residence, Breen, had been waiting. She took the document from the president's hand and glanced at it from the corner of her eyes. Then, she saw President Sieg nod inconspicuously. Breen trailed behind the crowd. She took out her encrypted phone and dialed a number. After a moment, she said softly, "Madam, Nutshell's performance is very good." None of the important people of the Federation who were walking toward the command hall noticed Breen's call. The National Security Advisor, who had walked a step behind President Sieg, saw the president's gloomy expression and hurried footsteps. He knew that what he had said in the conference room earlier was very inappropriate. Although President Sieg's term as president was about to end, the National Security Advisor did not want his personal relationship with him to be affected. He decided to explain something. Today, the one representing the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea Mecha is Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng. He is the grandson of that old man in Philadelphia. The National Security Advisor lowered his voice and said, "I considered this point, which is why I felt that if we used Nutshell as the standard, it might be a bit inappropriate." "What kind of person do you think Marshal Li is?" President Sieg abruptly turned around and reprimanded Li Yundong without any trace of politeness. His voice was not loud, but his tone was very heavy. "The criteria for deciding the battle is the Marshal's suggestion. Don't treat Marshal Li as an ordinary person." The National Security Advisor frowned slightly and said softly, "But it is not easy for the Federation to establish a heroic figure." There was a lot of unsaid meaning in this sentence. President Sieg's expression was dark. He thought to himself that this teacher was really getting worse and worse. He was actually using that insensible Marshal of Philadelphia to pressure the current president. He said slowly, "You don't need to worry about this matter. I have already issued an order earlier. The details of this mecha battle will be kept completely secret. The Bureau of Proclamation will list it as a fifth-order incident. The auxiliary flying wing effect in a vacuum environment cannot be fully displayed, but when Keijishin's mecha is climbing, the auxiliary flying wing's jet engine is very efficient in adjusting the mecha's posture." On the platform in the command hall, the large holographic screen was replaying the previous battle. Complex data and functional diagrams flashed past the screen as evidence for arguments. The Chief Technical Director of the Ministry of National Defense held a cursor in his hand and marked the contents of the holographic screen. His voice was transmitted through a microphone, echoing clearly in the center of the hall. The technicians of both sides were seriously checking the accuracy of the data. The technicians of the military were providing content for the director on the platform. The important figures of the Federation on the platform listened silently and seriously. The hall was silent. "Everyone, please pay attention to the CLK value and CLS value." The technical director used a cursor to point at the two curves on the holographic screen. Suppressing the excitement in his heart, he said as calmly as he could, "The power output indicators of the two test mecha have already greatly surpassed the limits of current technology. The quadruple power output of the twin engines has been fully demonstrated. The new ADS adaptive suspension system has also performed very well in this test. According to the data just obtained, the adaptive suspension systems of the 2MX mecha should be able to last for another 200 minutes or more during the passive wear and tear period." The technical director of the base coughed lightly and looked seriously at the important figures on the platform. He knew that most of them, including President Sieg, would not be able to understand these technical jargon. He paused for a moment, and then said with a smile, "Although the cause of the engine failure of Mecha No. 1 under overclocking has not yet been found, we can basically say that the Federation's revolutionary dual-engine mecha has been a success." It was a very normal sentence, but the command hall was filled with enthusiastic applause. The competition for the new MX Mecha standard was just a game of chess between the internal forces of the Federation. However, today's results showed that no matter who won or lost, in this vast galaxy, the Federation as a whole had already run ahead of the Empire. As a citizen of the Federation, everyone would feel proud of this. The experts and professors of the Federal Academy of Science were also applauding, but their expressions were not as relaxed and excited as those of the Nutshell Engineering Department. The technical director of the base spent another 10 minutes to report all the data from today's battle test. Then, the Academy of Science in charge of Mecha Number 1 chose a representative to come up on stage and give a final summary. This was a professor who looked to be in his 40s or 50s. The professor's expression was rather awkward, but he still very seriously repeated some of the important data, and then said seriously, regarding that last malfunction of the Purple Sea Mecha, we believe that it was an accident during overclocking. In this test, the superior performance of the Purple Sea Mecha has already been fully demonstrated. We cannot use a single accident to deny the excellence of the Purple Sea Mecha. This is not in line with the spirit of science. As these words left his mouth, the experts and professors of the Academy of Science all nodded. The federal military mechanics and engineers maintained their silence. Some of them recalled the terrifying performance of the Purple Sea Mecha earlier and felt that these words made sense. If the Federation gave up just like this, it would be too much of a pity. However, the technicians of the Nutshell Engineering Department were not having it. They did not care at all how many high-ranking officials and generals were on stage. They even completely forgot about the existence of the president. They whistled and began to make a ruckus. The Academy of Science professor on stage, however, calmed down at this time. He pretended that he did not hear the heckling of the Nutshell Engineering Department and said with great sincerity, if that failure can be resolved and the superior performance of the Purple Sea Mecha is preserved, I believe that this is the best ending. That professor said a few more things, but Shang Qiu did not listen at all. She only lowered her head to process the data sent over by her subordinates, weighing in her mind what she was going to say on stage later. She thought about Sulu, who was still above the old moon, and thought silently in her heart that this matter was not over yet. She was going to represent Sulu and certain people to give Director Lin Yuanhu, as well as everyone in this hall, a big surprise. Don't care what they say. Supervisor Jose hurried over at this time and put his phone into his pocket. He smiled at Shang Qiu's side and said, the matter has been settled. The president has already decided to use our standards. I am not surprised by this. The Academy of Sciences electronic jet design has a problem. The stability of the dual engines under overclocking is something they have no way of solving at all. Shang Qiu raised her head and used her fingertips to push up the frame of her glasses on the bridge of her nose as she said this with a smile. Her smile gradually faded, because she found that Supervisor Jose's expression was rather serious. At this time, the command hall was in a state of chaos. That Academy of Science professor was still trying hard to salvage something, but the audience was in an uproar. No one had noticed the conversation between her and Jose. Did you and Sulu know about this result beforehand? Mr. Jose was not looking at her, but rather at Professor Chen Shu of the Academy of Science on stage. That professor was saying at this time that the Purple Sea's final failure should have been caused by overheating of the engine system after overclocking for too long. As long as the corresponding design changes were made, this problem could be solved. Hearing this, Shang Qiu was slightly taken aback. She did not understand why Supervisor Jose would say this at this time. Even if the company had guessed what she was going to do when she went on stage later, wasn't this something that should be done? I've already asked Mr. CEO. Supervisor Jose lowered his head and said softly, since we've already won, let's not cause any more trouble. After all, we are all part of the Federation. Forcing the leader of the Federation's academic community into a corner and humiliating an old man is not something to be happy about. Shang Qiu was silent for a long time, analyzing the meaning of Supervisor Jose's words in her heart. A moment later, she raised her head and looked at him with a very complicated gaze. She said, I don't know what kind of deal these big shots of the Federation made in those few minutes just now, but Mr. Jose, you should know very well that I'm just a simple-minded technician. I promised Sulu, so I will definitely do it. Jose did not think that she would actually dare to reject his arrangements in front of his face. His brows furrowed extremely tightly, and he lowered his voice and quickly reprimanded, the President, the Parliament, the Board of Directors, the entire Federation, no one is willing to hear what you want to say later. He spoke sincerely and sternly. Seeing Shang Qiu lower her head and not say anything, he knew that she should have tacitly agreed to his arrangements. Only then did he let out a breath of relief. He sighed softly and said, Dean Lin will hand in his resignation tomorrow. After all, his position in the hearts of the people is very high. If a scandal were to erupt at this time, the government's credibility in the hearts of the Federation's citizens will probably drop to a terrifying level. At this time when the Empire is about to make a move, the Federation needs the citizens' absolute trust in the government. Chapter 258. Seeing the technical representative of Nutshell take the stage, the command hall immediately became much quieter than before. Then, another round of applause rang out. This time, the applause was softer, but it lasted longer. The technicians of Nutshell looked excitedly at the young technical director on the stage. They knew better than anyone what kind of decisive role this genius female PhD had played in the development of the MX mecha. Even the military generals on the viewing platform began to applaud, expressing their admiration for the technical prowess of the younger generation of the Federation. After the applause died down, Shang Qiu still did not speak. She flipped through the data gently, as if she had encountered an extremely difficult problem. After a long time, she took a deep breath and said slowly, just now, Professor Cui from the Academy of Science said that the two mecha almost broke down at the same time in the end. I would like to explain this problem first. The final collapse of Nutshell's little white flower mecha was due to the long period of external attacks. On this point, we have to admit that the pilot controlling the Purple Sea had great combat power. On the other hand, the collapse of the Purple Sea was due to an internal engine error. In future battles with the Empire, which one is more fatal is a very simple logical question. At this point, Shang Qiu paused for a moment. She habitually used the tips of her slender fingers to push up the frame of her glasses on her nose. Her nails were not painted with anything, looking very fresh and beautiful. She knew very well that Manager Jose's strict orders from below the stage were not false. This Federation actually did not welcome the things she had wanted to do at the beginning. When Sulu had first released the news online, the President's office had already been enraged. They had wanted to beat the leader of the Federation's academic community down to the ground. Moreover, they had wanted to ruthlessly step on his old face. This had indeed touched the sensitive nerves of many important people and hurt many people's interests, even if these important people had initially stood on the opposite side of the Federal Academy of Science. However, this actually had nothing to do with the trust of the citizens towards the government that Jose had just mentioned. This was purely a matter of face for the Federation. The class that controlled this Federation did not want to show their ugly side in front of the ordinary citizens of the Federation. Even the citizens of the Federation probably did not want to know about Director Lin Yuanhu's moral problems. Once the beautiful image of a master idol was shattered, it would bring about mental pain. Thus, most people would rather not know the truth, only living in the lofty facade created by the newspapers and periodicals. Shang Qiu thought to himself in a self-deprecating manner. Wasn't he the same? Before Sulu used data, calculations, and today's facts to convince her, how could she believe that Dean Lin Yuanhu would do those things? She was not going to say anything else, so she closed the calculations she had been preparing for a long time. Slowly raising her head, she said, the Purple Sea mecha's performance is indeed excellent, but since it is a new military standard mecha, its stability is of course. Suddenly, she saw familiar faces on her right. They were her partners who had worked day and night with her for several years. Her partners all had puzzled expressions on their faces. They were probably wondering why Shang Qiu was so calm today. The other people in the command hall were not surprised. A young and beautiful female engineer was able to become a first-class technical supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department. There must be a lot of different things about her. The people of the federal military felt that this level of calmness was the quality of the engineer who designed the MX mecha. I can't go on, Shang Qiu suddenly said with a frown. Shang Qiu suddenly frowned and said. Then she took off her glasses and threw them on the table. Looking at the people on the stage, she took a few deep breaths and said, because this is not what I wanted to say. Below the stage, Mr. Jose's expression darkened slightly. He had received a call earlier and found out about the final decision of the board of directors, and Mr. President. That was why he had spoken to Shang Qiu earlier. However, at this moment, it seemed that Shang Qiu on the stage had lost control of her emotions. He was about to send someone else up when a voice rang out from the stands. What did you originally want to say? Then say it. The people in the command hall turned to look and found that the speaker was President Sieg. Shang Qiu glanced at the president with some surprise, and then glanced at Dean Lin not far from the president's side. She found that in these few hours, Dean Lin Yuanhu looked quite a few years older. She was silent for a long time. Her fingertips on the table suddenly brushed against the frame of her glasses. She paused slightly, as if waking up. Taking a deep breath, she flipped open the data book on the table and said in a clear voice, regarding today's MX Mecha combat test, I only want to say a few points. 1. The Nutshell Engineering Department 1. 2. Since 14 years ago, when the seniors of the Nutshell Engineering Department started the project, the design goal of the MX Mecha was close combat at high speed. The MX Mecha will definitely, and is currently, changing the way land combat is conducted in the future. Only new mecha can deal with new mecha, and overclocking combat will be very common. An MX that cannot support overclocking combat is not an MX at all. 3. The Purple Sea's final engine failure was not a problem of overheating, but a fatal flaw in the design. This design error cannot be fixed at all unless the assembly system is modified. At this time, a professor from the Academy of Science in the audience suddenly protested softly, since it can be modified, why say that it cannot be fixed? Shang Qiu glanced at him and said word by word, because the Academy of Science's design started from a wrong parameter in the momentum measurable function model. In reality, after correcting this parameter, the assembly design that can be made will definitely lose a portion of its mobility. There is only one way to solve this problem. The Nutshell Engineering Department discovered this wrong parameter and corrected it, resulting in the current little white flower. If the Academy of Science can fix this error, the final mecha engine system they design will definitely be identical to the little white flower we designed. And now, we already have the little white flower. Is there a need to modify the Purple Sea into a little white flower? These words echoed in the command hall. The professors and experts in the Academy of Science area all revealed angry expressions. Although the design philosophy of the two MXs was the same, the basic core data and function model had been researched separately. What right did the Nutshell Engineering Department have to be so sure that if the Academy of Science's MX was to be modified, they could only go down the Nutshell Engineering Department's old path? Shang Qiu lowered his head slightly and said softly, the reason why I am so sure of this is because I know, and some people know as well. The theory, core data, and function model used by the Federal Academy of Sciences MX Mecha to solve the problem of the electron jet, are exactly the same as the Nutshell Engineering Department's data. This is the fourth point I want to make today, and also the last point. The meaning of this sentence was a bit of a mouthful, but how could the many experts immersed in the field of science not understand? Shang Qiu was officially accusing the Federal Academy of Science of plagiarizing or stealing the results of the Nutshell Engineering Department's research on the electron jet. For a moment, the entire command hall was in an uproar. The staff of the Nutshell Engineering Department had already heard of this rumor through the internet. Although they did not understand why engineer Shang Qiu was so sure, they were not too surprised. However, The experts of the General Assembly Base and the Federal Academy of Science were also a bit angry. Plagiarism was without a doubt the most serious accusation in the academic world. The research and development of the MX mecha at the Federal Academy of Science had always been personally led by Dean Lin Yuanhu. How could these members of the Federation's academic community believe that the respected leader would do such a shameless thing? Shang Qiu raised his head and put on his glasses again. He did not look at the increasingly hunched body of the old man in the stands. Instead, he looked at the still angry experts of the Academy of Science and said calmly, "I know this is a very serious accusation, but it is also the truth. Because long before this battle, I and another technical supervisor of the engineering department had already calculated from the original data that the Purple Sea mecha, after entering the overclock state, would not last more than 3 minutes." After saying this, Shang Qiu connected the data storage box in his hand to the instrument on the table. On the holographic screen in the command hall, a few complex structural design diagrams appeared, as well as a few important parameter deviations that did not involve confidentiality. Looking at the rolling diagrams and parameter analysis on the holographic screen, the experts and professors gradually quieted down. They felt that the whole thing was beginning to develop in a strange direction. Shang Qiu's indifferent voice continued to sound in the command hall following the results of these calculations. The failure of the experiment last autumn was precisely due to a problem with the Z4 electron jet. The MX must complete the capture of the electron jet traces. The core data we used to solve this problem was the result of the research of Professor Shen Yulin of the Husk Institute. Let us begin our calculations from this original function model with the wrong parameters. The orientation of the particle entering the pipe interface is as shown on the diagram. The structural changes of the mecha's engine containment chamber are as shown on the diagram. The problem is that after the MX enters the overclock state, the dual-engine particle containment chamber will be in a quantum full state for a long time. The originally captured electron jet traces will change slightly again. The modified Z4 electron jet requires a second adjustment, but with the current level of technology of the Federation, this is something that cannot be done. After a long period of hard work, the Nutshell Engineering Department found and corrected the wrong parameter, changing the design of the Z4 electron jet once again. In order to do so, they sacrificed a portion of the power output. However, they successfully avoided the fatal problem that would occur in the engine under quantum saturation. Let us continue to follow the Academy of Sciences design and calculate downward. Because of the existence of the wrong parameter, the Purple Sea's Z4 electron jet design still followed the first path. The result of this was that the engine of machine number 1 suddenly stopped working. In the quiet command hall, Shang Qiu used simple words and the clear calculation process on the holographic screen to clearly and directly calculate why the Purple Sea's mecha had stopped working. She pushed up her glasses and looked down at the experts of the Academy of Science. Calmly, she said, "We only need to calculate, and we will know the final result." The last blueprint appeared under the holographic screen in the command hall. It was a drawing of the cracks on the inner wall of the engine made under laboratory conditions. Those cracks spread out in a radial pattern, leaving traces that could be seen. It was a shocking sight. The Purple Sea mecha on Mount Kaki in the old month has already entered the recovery program. Later, we can compare the remaining traces of the Purple Sea mecha's engine with this blueprint that I calculated beforehand. It will be very clear that the core data and functional model used by the Purple Sea mecha were all data that the Nutshell Engineering Department had long grasped. Below the stage, a professor from the Federal Academy of Science suddenly shouted, "What does this mean? This can't prove anything." Shang Qiu knew that this professor was the person in charge of the high-amplitude particle physics laboratory in the Federal Academy of Science and Technology. She frowned and replied, "If it wasn't for the Purple Sea explosion today, I indeed wouldn't have been able to prove anything. However, these radial patterns on the inner wall of the engine are enough to prove that your Academy of Science has done something. You have no evidence." The person in charge retorted angrily, "It must be that the Nutshell Engineering Department stole the data of the Academy of Science beforehand and found this hidden danger," but he didn't say anything. Now, he is using it to shamelessly slander us. Shang Qiu guessed that the professor below the stage must have been involved in the theft of the data. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so angry. Even now, he still insisted on quibbling. She could no longer control her emotions and said angrily to the people below the stage, "Don't forget that Professor Shen Yulin's core data was electronically protected. There is a backup in the Federal Central Computer. If you were just using it as a reference, no one would have found anything, but you actually copied it completely. With the backup of the central computer and the traces on the inner wall of the engine, this is irrefutable evidence." The female engineer looked at the silent Academy of Science professors with disappointment. After a moment, she said softly and indifferently, "You people are like clumsy thieves. You copied the test papers of your desk mate, but in the end, you even copied the answers that we wrote wrong at the beginning. The Federation's academic community is controlled by a group of shameless and stupid people like you. What future can there be?" This analogy was very good and powerful. The Academy of Science was directly hit speechless and did not have the courage to make any more excuses. On the stage, Shang Qiu's face was full of disappointment. She took a few deep breaths before she suppressed the complicated emotions in her heart and prepared to leave the stage. However, at this moment, Dean Lin Yuanhu slowly stood up and asked, "Do you have anything else to ask?" Shang Qiu was silent for a long time. She then said, "The time of the Purple Sea engine failure that we calculated should be 3 minutes later, but in reality, it happened 37 seconds earlier." Lin Yuanhu's body looked particularly bleak in the stands. He nodded and replied, "I don't have much research on quantum dynamics. After getting Yulin's data, based on my years of knowledge and intuition, I always felt that there was a parameter in the function model. It always seemed a bit out of place and a bit unsightly when placed in the queue. The older a person is, the more timid they become. Not to mention, this is the microscopic domain that I am not good at. Therefore, I did not make any changes to this parameter. I only reminded my colleagues in the institute to add a high-sensitivity device to the Z4 electron jet. Once there was an abnormal situation in the engine reactor, it would react. The Purple Sea engine did fail, but it did not spread to the fuselage and cause a full-scale explosion. I am very comforted by this." Shang Qiu suddenly asked, "Is it an irreversible cooling reaction?" "Yes." Chapter 259. With the data backup from the Federal Central Computer in the basement of the Bureau of Proclamation, as well as the radial crack distribution on the inner wall of the engine calculated by the Nutshell Engineering Department beforehand, unless the Nutshell Engineering Department could predict the future, there was no other explanation other than the Academy of Science plagiarizing the Nutshell Engineering Department's data. The broken engine of the Purple Sea mecha far away in the old moon was no longer important, at least to the Academy of Science. If the burn flow traces on the engine were really the same as the image Shang Qiu had shown them, this kind of post-mortem investigation would be a humiliation they could not bear. When the young female engineer from the Nutshell Engineering Department mentioned this point, Dean Lin Yuanhu knew that there was no point in hiding the truth anymore. So he stood up somewhat tiredly and said a few words to the other party, indirectly admitting that the Academy of Science had plagiarized Professor Shen Yulin's core data. The old dean had already stood up at this time. He narrowed his somewhat cloudy eyes and looked at the female engineer on the stage. The age spots on his face were particularly clear. At this moment, he looked at the young woman and thought of Shen Yulin in the cemetery. He thought of Shen Yulin's last disciple in the old moon, that guy called Su Lu. Some time ago, Dean Lin Yuanhu had gone to the Milky Way cemetery to see Professor Shen's grave. After all, the two of them were once close friends. Although in their long lives, because of a certain despicable person, they had parted ways, Dean Lin Yuanhu bowed slightly in all directions and did not say a word. Back then, he needed to perfect the design of the warship's multi-engine system. He needed the Academy of Sciences resources and a step forward, so he secretly copied and extended Professor Shen Yulin's M-series design. That was how he gained the glory and status of the past few decades. Decades had passed, and Shen Yulin was already dead. Under his suppression, no one dared to mention the academic storm from back then. He was still used to working and living that way, but in the end, he suffered the heaviest blow of his life in the development of the MX mecha. That guy who likes to smoke, could he be laughing at me in the cemetery right now? The old and weak Dean Lin thought to himself. The entire command hall was dead silent. At this time, no one dared to open their mouths because the truth that Shang Qiu had revealed was too shocking. The important figures of the Federation in the stands all looked towards the president, but all they saw was President Sieg's incomparably gloomy face. Shang Qiu looked at the thin figure of Dean Lin in the stands, and countless complex emotions welled up in her heart. She actually couldn't bear to look at this hunched old man. Although she knew very well that Su's mission was to seek justice, the Academy of Science and Dean Lin Shit's reputation, she still lowered her head silently and began sorting through the data evidence. Back then, Lin Yuanhu had led the Federation's scientific community to successfully develop the M52 mecha, and perfected the design of the warship's multi-engine system. Then, the Federation's mobile company produced the mecha, establishing an immortal contribution. With his position in the Federation these past few years and the substantial results he had achieved, if he just stepped down from the position of Dean of the Academy of Science, it would be enough to earn him a lifetime of respect. However, the human heart was never enough. Just as Li Xiuzhu had once lamented, the most difficult hurdle in Lin Yuanhu's life was the word name. Before this academic leader retired, he had still wanted to carve his name on the revolutionary new mecha, putting in another heavy chip to win the Nebula Lifetime Achievement Award, but in the end, he had failed because of this matter. Shang Qiu was a student of the capital university, but she had once sat in on Dean Lin's lectures at the First Military Academy. Lin Yuanhu's perfect explanation of the warship's multi-engine system had a great impact on her. The reason she could finally complete the design of the dual-engine system based on the research of her predecessors in the Nutshell Engineering Department could be said to have a lot to do with Dean Lin's research results. Today, in front of everyone, she had accused Lin Yuanhu of plagiarism. The moment she lowered her head to tidy up, she couldn't help but think of a scene from 4 years ago. That year, the Dean of the Federal Academy of Science, Lin Yuanhu, paid a rare visit to the Shell Motor Company's space headquarters. He gave a speech to the design staff and promised to answer questions after the speech. At the time, Shang Qiu had already entered the Nutshell Engineering Department. After hearing the news, she asked for leave at the last minute to attend this rare event. However, after the speech, the space headquarters venue was silent. Lin Yuanhu stood on the podium for a long time, but still, no one asked a question. When the respected dean left with a smile, the human resources manager of the Nutshell Space Headquarters asked the engineering staff in confusion, "This is such a rare opportunity. Why didn't you raise your hand to ask a question?" After a moment of silence, one of the engineers replied with a sigh, "If you asked the creator to ask a question, would you dare?" At the time, Shang Qiu also held the same view of this old man in the Federation's academic community. However, today, she had personally knocked him off his pedestal. She silently hugged the documents and walked down the podium. She didn't pay attention to Mr. Jose, who was frowning. She also didn't speak to her colleagues beside her. She directly sat down in her seat. The command hall was silent. However, this silence was completely different from the silence in the venue that year. President Sigurd stood up with a heavy expression. He didn't even look at Lin Yuanhu and left the command hall. Lin Yuanhu stood quietly in the center of the viewing platform. His body was slightly bent, and he looked unusually desolate. In the dead silent polar region of the moon, a formation of 4 spaceships flew to the platform at the top of Mount Kaki. The spaceships reluctantly landed. The mechanical door at the bottom of the spaceship opened. The thick mechanical arm began to retrieve the mecha. The 3 major systems of the Purple Sea mecha were basically all scrapped. After the Purple Sea mecha fell, Little White Flower couldn't bear the strain of the mecha's body anymore. When the Federal military's battleship took off, the 2 mechas were like 2 piles of garbage. They couldn't make any angry objections to the rough movements of the thick mechanical arm. The mechanical arm retracted. The mechanical door at the bottom of the spaceship closed. With a large jet of air, the spaceship broke free of the moon's gravity and flew towards the dark side of the moon. Inside the spacious spaceship, dozens of soldiers were busy inspecting the spaceships. Under the control of the computer, the ring-shaped metal mechanical arm was quickly dismantling the two scrapped mechas. Whether it was the descendant of the Lees of Philadelphia or the nutshell mecha master who won the final victory, to the federal military, they were all extremely valuable assets. The federal military naturally didn't want their safety to be in any danger. In the cockpit, Su Li's lips were already curled up with dry flying skin. After Little White Flower stopped working, he took the initiative to remove the simulation system and put it back into the black box. He then changed into the backup operations suit. He knew that this black box wouldn't be able to hide it from the military researchers, but he didn't want to tell them anything. As one of the designers of the MX mecha and the pilot who won, Sulu had this confidence in his heart. The cabin door opened. The soft artificial light replaced the harsh light of the stars in the vacuum environment. Sulu squinted his eyes and immediately adapted to the environment inside the spaceship. With the help of a few medical personnel, he forced himself to suppress the soreness in his muscles and crawled out of the cockpit with difficulty. Looking back, he saw that the beautiful Little White Flower's mecha was no longer the same as before. It was like it had been kicked countless times. It was black and distorted. It was very ugly and miserable. What is this? Two military mechanics in charge of collecting data lifted the black leather box and asked Sulu. Sulu blinked tiredly and said, "Personal item. You can check the catalog. Please don't touch it." On the other side of the spacious cabin, Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng in the Purple Sea mecha also walked out with the help of the soldiers. Purple Sea's damage was more serious than Little White Flower's. When the military spaceship dragged the mecha back, the researchers discovered with fear that Purple Sea's last layer of life support system was already on the verge of collapse. If they had been any slower, the pilot in Purple Sea might have directly come into contact with the vacuum of the moon's surface. However, Madman Li didn't need anyone to support him. This was because compared to Sulu, the impact on his body was smaller. From the moment Purple Sea collapsed, this 16-year-old genius pilot fell into silence. His face, which was already prone to violent expressions, was now so cold that it made people's hearts palpitate. The special operations suit from before was no longer tightly wrapped around his explosive body. He was wearing a lieutenant colonel's military uniform. Standing on the floor, he turned his head to look at the other side of the cabin. A trace of unwillingness flashed through his eyes. "Lieutenant Colonel, what is this?" A mechanic stood at the door of the cockpit and asked while holding a small box in his hand. Madman Li turned his head to look at the man and said coldly, "Personal item. Don't touch it. After checking the catalog, return it to me." In the catalog of test body components provided by the Federal Academy of Science and the Shell Motor Company, Su Li's black box and Li Feng's small box were not there. The two mechanics each carried these two items and walked towards the storage compartment of the spaceship. Because the pilots of the Federal Army always had the habit of putting some special items in their mechas in order to get good omens, they didn't particularly care about these two boxes. They just felt that the personal items used by these two ace pilots to suppress their mechas were a little too big. One of the mechanics was numbering the items when he suddenly asked curiously, "That lieutenant colonel named Li Feng, I heard, he's the grandson of the army god?" The other mechanic frowned and said, "Just now, the captain passed on the order from the department. This mecha battle is to be kept a secret. Apparently, it's an incident involving the fifth sequence of the Bureau of Proclamation." "What are you still talking about?" "I'm just talking to you. Besides, I don't mean to be disrespectful to the army god. I'm just very curious. What kind of mechas do the Lees of Philadelphia usually use? You should know that when we were in the 7th Armored Division, our division commander's most precious special mecha camp usually used his own women's underwear." That person smiled and said, Then, his gaze fell on the two boxes. Chapter 260. If these two mechanics really had the guts and ability to open these two boxes, perhaps they would be able to get close to one of the secrets of the Lees of Philadelphia that allowed them to roam the universe. However, it was unknown whether they were lucky or unlucky. The Federal Army's strict discipline and their respect for the two mechanics prevented them from trying to do such a thing. After going through the careful inspection of the medical equipment and medical personnel, and after a few more scans, Sulu was finally allowed to take a proper bath. However, even the bath process was under the supervision of a second lieutenant. There were actually not many people who had personally witnessed the mecha battle today, but the Federation military spaceship in charge of the follow-up procedures had a general understanding of the situation. Although the military personnel on the spaceship were particularly strict in their monitoring, their eyes often revealed a respectful expression. After all, Sulu was a normal person. After washing away his tiredness with the hot water and relieving some of his soreness, he changed into a comfortable military uniform without epaulets. Looking at the eyes of the military personnel who followed him, he gradually began to enjoy the feeling of victory. He knew that Madman Lee was definitely going through the same procedures as him, but what puzzled him was that the spaceship seemed to have received some sort of order, and he was most likely being isolated. Perhaps this was the Federal military's standard procedure. Sulu thought for a while, then sat on the chair and looked at the scenery outside the window. He silently calculated the time in his heart, and then looked at the edge of the upper right side of the window. He confirmed that this spaceship was not flying towards the old moon base, but towards the dark side of the moon. This place is closer to the fleet base, the second lieutenant explained. Sulu nodded, recalling that there were several secret bases of the Federal fleet on the dark side of the moon. "Is there anything you need me to do?" the second lieutenant asked politely. "Yes, when can my box be returned to me?" Sulu was very concerned about this. The standard follow-up procedures have been completed. After the higher-ups give the order, when you leave the old moon base, the box will be returned to you, the second lieutenant replied with a smile. "Thank you." Sulu rubbed his stomach, then suddenly said self-deprecatingly, "Can you give me something to eat?" "Yes, the more the better." Yes, after experiencing such a thrilling mecha battle, in order to control the simulation system, the abundant burning energy in his body had not been completely depleted, but the common hunger in his stomach was surging up again. Under the second lieutenant's incredulous gaze, Sulu ate 12 pieces of bread and drank 7 cups of protein milk before wiping his mouth in satisfaction. The hunger subsided slightly, and he had time to reflect on the previous battle, this thrilling victory, the explosion of the Purple Sea engine, and the storm that might follow. Outside the window was the desolate surface of the dark side of the moon. Black light energy conversion materials were scattered among the scattered mountains and lowlands in an irregular pattern. Sulu narrowed his eyes to look at the desolate scenery, and saw a circular base not far away. He knew that he had arrived at the secret base of the Federal fleet. To the citizens of the Federation, being able to go deep into the dark side of the old moon and see the rumored circular base of the Federal fleet was something worth bragging about. However, Sulu was not excited at all. He was thinking about other things, so he narrowed his eyes and remained motionless. Escaping from the foot of Mount Kaki to the peak, and then being suppressed by the terrifying attacks of the Purple Sea while in overclocking mode, Sulu had persevered for so long in such a passive situation. The ability that exceeded the limits of the human body had overdrawn his mental and physical strength. Sitting in the chair, he felt very tired, as if he was about to collapse. At this time, his thoughts were so complicated and chaotic. Looking at the rise and fall of the dark side of the old moon, he unknowingly fell asleep. In his dream, he thought of many things, many people, especially that righteous face of Senator Macklin, which was deeply engraved in his dream. In his dream, he only did not think of that dark dream. This was really a happy moment. The days in the Federal Fleet's circular base were very boring. After a few hours of rest, Sulu began to write his own battle test report on the standard form provided by the base. The Federation's first MX Mecha battle test had ended. The data of the Purple Sea and Little White Flower had already been compiled in the command hall. However, Su Lu and Li Feng's direct reports were also very important. The first-hand experience of a pilot in a battle environment was very important for the federal military's future work in training MX pilots. The Old Moon Standard Time was 8 p.m. Only then did Su Lu know why he had been sent to the Federal Fleet's circular base after the mecha battle ended. The federal military had increased the confidentiality level of this mecha battle by 2 levels. Everyone who had participated in and watched this battle had to sign a confidentiality agreement. Moreover, these data agreements had been collected by the Bureau of Proclamation and dealt with according to the 5th level. He did not know what had happened in the command hall, but after a conversation with the chief officer of the circular base, he vaguely guessed that the federal military probably did not want the news of the failure of the successor of the Lees of Philadelphia to spread. Perhaps this did not mean much now, but if the Federation and the Empire were to go to war in the future, the military would still need the name of the Lees of Philadelphia. As long as they did not admit that the Academy of Science had failed, Su Lu made a call to S2 after obtaining permission from the chief officer. From Shang Qiu, he found out everything that had happened in the command hall after the battle ended. The Federal Academy of Science had already concluded that plagiarism had been committed. Su Lu had done what he had wanted to do. Holding the receiver, he fell silent, but his right hand was gently clenched. If the board of directors has any problems, just tell them the truth. After all, I was the one who asked you to do this. From Shang Qiu's retelling, Su Lu knew that the accusations made by the engineering department against Lin Yuan, who this time had angered many powers within the Federation. Even the upper management of the Nutshell Company was somewhat angry at Shang Qiu's disobedience. He could guess this possibility. After all, Lin Yuan, who had stood tall within the Federation for so many years, and who knew how many people's interests were involved with him. Technology was indeed power, or else Su Lu and Shang Qiu would not have been able to make Lin Yuan lose face. However, reputation was even more powerful, so from the government to the Federation, no one wanted to see these 2 youngsters from the Nutshell Engineering Department do such a thing. After hanging up the encrypted phone call, Su Lu was not worried about the situation. In other words, he did not care about the reputation or status that the Federation would give him. Instead, he felt a touch of disdain and anger. Even Shang Qiu did not know that the core data that the Federal Academy of Science had stolen from the laboratory had been tampered with by him. Using Shang Qiu's powerful and resonant example in the command hall, Su Lu had deliberately written a wrong answer in advance before his deskmate had plagiarized. The Federation did not want Dean Lin to be involved in a plagiarism scandal, and neither did the Nutshell Company. This was because the big shots and politicians in the upper management could play tricks and compromise to gain benefits. However, Su Lu didn't want to obtain anything. He had spent half a year and put in a lot of sweat and blood. What this 20-year-old young man wanted was only one principle. Su Lu was a good person, but he was also a vengeful and persistent person. Before old Professor Shen had passed away, he had given Lin Yuanhu an unwarranted trust, so Lin Yuanhu could only repay old Professor Shen by persevering without hesitation. He only wanted to write old Professor Shen's name on the MX Mecha, to write it in the glorious history of the Federation. He only wanted to stomp on Lin Yuanhu's name once, until it was 1,000,000 times. Now, all of this had become reality. He was very satisfied. Next, it would be another old man's turn. 4 days passed. From the senior officer of the base, Su Lu found out that the military's investigation period was about to end. His mood lightened slightly. A loud metallic clang rang out. Beside the metal and cement composite wall of the circular base that was 400 meters high, the high-speed freight elevator doors closed. Su Lu and the second lieutenant who had always been by his side were in this elevator, looking out. The light of the stars flashed across the surface of the moon, illuminating countless golden shadows on the uneven surface of the moon. Those black light energy materials and hidden protrusions under the surface were so shocking in this desolate stretch of space. The circular base of the Federal Fleet occupied a large area. This high-speed freight elevator was like a small black dot on the edge of the high wall. The elevator moved up silently, the sturdy multi-layered transparent film isolating the vacuum environment. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the surface of the moon that was moving further and further away. He felt the insignificance of individual humans in the silent universe and fell silent for a moment. He had been under house arrest in a specific area these past few days and had basically not encountered any military personnel. Madman Li must have also enjoyed this special treatment, but the two of them had not met. Could it be that that person was avoiding him, afraid that he would have to fulfill the bet? Sulu looked at the large-scale scenery of the universe outside the elevator, took a deep breath, and laughed happily. During the battle on Mount Kaki, Suli's anger had almost ignited the mecha, but that was the anger in his heart, caused by his past experiences. After a few days, he no longer had the urge to trample Madman Li under his feet. On one hand, it was because he knew that Madman Li had lost to him because of the Purple Sea mecha itself. On the other hand, he always felt that it was really meaningless to compete with a 16-year-old kid. Many times, Sulu had almost forgotten that he was only 20 years old. The sound of the elevator arriving rang out. Sulu reluctantly retracted his gaze from the desolate scenery of the dark side of the moon and followed the second lieutenant out. As soon as he stepped out of the elevator door, he heard a familiar voice. Because it was in the spacious corridor of the base, that person's voice was as cold and ruthless as usual, buzzing and soaring. Today was the day they would leave the circular base, head to the old moon base, and then return to planet S2. The corridor on the uppermost level of the circular base was hundreds of meters away from the surface of the moon. Standing at the edge of the transparent corridor always gave people a frightening feeling of being at the edge of a cliff. That voice was so cold and yet so loud, shaking the corridor slightly and making the surrounding soldiers feel a little scared. Madman Li was currently arguing with the officer stationed in the base with a dark face. To be precise, it was a one-sided reprimand. He was a lieutenant colonel, so there was naturally no problem in reprimanding a second lieutenant. However, that female second lieutenant with teary eyes had clearly never served such a difficult person before. Her small face was red, and she could not say anything. The uppermost level of the base was filled with senior officers. Sulu and Madman Li's identities did not need to be kept a secret to them. These officers looked over with complicated expressions, guessing why Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had suddenly become so angry. Could it be related to that test on Mount Kaki a few days ago? Sulu was a person who had tender feelings for the fairer sex, but he was also a reasonable person. He listened silently at the elevator door for a while, and after confirming that it was Li Feng who was unreasonable, his pair of knife-like eyebrows rose up, and he slowly walked over. Surrounding the corridor on the top floor of the circular base was the spacious moon's vacuum. In the extreme distance was the highest peak on the back of the old moon. The starlight in the sky was not swallowed up by the stars, sprinkling down piece by piece. In the clear light, the officers in the corridor saw the two officers walking over from the elevator door. They recognized the other party's identity and saw him walk over to Li Feng. Their hearts immediately tightened, and among them, the ones with fast reactions immediately notified the base's commanding officer. The sound of footsteps slowly sounded and slowly descended. With his hands behind his back, Li Feng was silent for a moment, and then he slowly turned his head around. That body full of explosive strength suddenly tightened, and then he gradually relaxed. He looked at Sulu behind him and said lightly, "I never thought that you would actually know how to drive a mecha. It looks like you're not the pretty boy I thought you were. I never thought that the only seedling from the Lees of Philadelphia would only vent his anger on a woman. It looks like you really are a little idiot." For some reason, Sulu was originally a gentle and kind person, but every time he saw Madman Li, he couldn't control his sharp and unkind side. These two people were like natural enemies, and no matter who looked at the other, they were both extremely unpleasant to the eye. In the starry corridor, the two young officers were facing each other in silence. The air was filled with a tense atmosphere, and it seemed like there were electric arcs flashing incessantly. The female second lieutenant, who had been reprimanded by Madman Lee until her eyes were brimming with tears, actually forgot her own sadness at this moment. She looked at this scene in astonishment and looked at Sulu in confusion, not understanding why the corridor had suddenly become so quiet. A hint of coldness flashed across Madman Lee's childish face, and he slowly said, "You should know better than anyone that if it weren't for those bunch of trash from the Academy of Science, you wouldn't have been able to survive on Kaki Peak." Sulu looked at him with narrowed eyes, feeling that dangerous aura and might that assaulted his face. He said softly, "You're not convinced?" Madman Lee's lips curled up slightly, and he laughed strangely. "If it were you, would you be convinced?" Sulu was silent for a long time, and then he suddenly smiled and said, "What's the use of not being convinced? You still have to call me uncle." Madman Lee's expression suddenly changed. Chapter 261. Ignoring the expression on Li Feng's face, Sulu only looked at him quietly. He narrowed his eyes as if he couldn't feel the anger and murderous intent in this young lieutenant colonel's heart. He just looked at him and waited for his reply. Right at this moment, Major General Shi, the commanding officer of the circular base, rushed over after receiving the news. He was the highest military officer in the entire base. Although Li Feng was born in a prestigious family and held a high position in the Federal Army, he still didn't dare to be too presumptuous in front of him. He lowered his head slightly and moved to one side. Major General Shi looked coldly at Sulu and Li Feng. In his eyes, Li Feng was undoubtedly the most outstanding soldier. Although his personality was a bit too domineering, the Federal Army needed this kind of talent. Meanwhile, Sulu, the pilot from Nutshell Company, had obtained the final victory at Kachi Feng and won his respect as a soldier. No matter who it was, he didn't want to be too harsh on them, but at this moment, he had no choice but to reprimand them. The conflict ended here, but it wasn't really over yet. At least before they left Old Moon Base, they still had to settle that bet. The military spaceship was already waiting at the highest platform of the circular base. Under the accompaniment of several soldiers, Sulu and Li Feng boarded the spaceship and flew towards the Old Moon Base. After a few hours of flight, the spaceship landed right in the middle of the large cluster of bubbles. The end of the tunnel was bright. This group of officers walked out of the underground tunnel. The busy people of the Old Moon Base put down their work at the same time and looked over with a myriad of different emotions. The federal military and the Bureau of Proclamation had jointly issued a confidentiality order. The entire base of people who had witnessed the battle at Kachi Feng were forbidden from talking about the incident. However, just because they didn't say anything didn't mean they didn't want to. The officers of the Old Moon Base looked at Li Feng and Sulu walking in the middle of the crowd with mixed feelings. They all knew about the bet of this mecha battle and wondered if the successor of the God of War was really going to lower his head to that skinny technical supervisor. When they reached the living area, the two sides had to separate. At this moment, Madman Lee suddenly stopped. Sulu also stopped his footsteps, turning his head to look at this young lieutenant colonel's tall and sturdy back, not saying a single word. Li Feng slowly turned around. After a long silence, he took a deep breath and said in a normal voice, "Uncle Su, I hope we can meet again in the future." Sulu was slightly stunned, and then he smiled. His smile was particularly bright, and his eyes were like crescent moons. He said, "You have to call me uncle when we meet. I always thought that you would never want to see me again." The Old Moon Base's main hall, which had always maintained a silent and suffocating atmosphere, could no longer control their complex emotions after hearing these two sentences. The officers were not whispering to each other, but sighing in disappointment and helplessness. The officers who sent them to the circular base of the fleet were also speechless. When he saw Zhou Yu, Sulu knew that the military had done a very good job of keeping this test a secret. All the video recordings of the Kaki Peak had been sealed. Other than the few officers in the two bases, even the Shell Motor Company's technical team did not know who the pilot of the little white flower mecha was. Sulu originally thought that the military wanted to keep this a secret because they wanted to protect the glory of Fae City's god of war, but he did not expect that it would also involve him. Thinking about it carefully, it was probably Lady Tai who had done some work. But why would Lady Tai do this? Sulu frowned and thought for a long time, but he still could not figure it out. 3 days ago, the Shell Motor Company's technical team had withdrawn S1 from the core area of the base. The Shell Motor Company had specially left the CEO's spaceship behind to be responsible for bringing Sulu back to the surface. This kind of treatment and honor proved that the victory of this new mecha battle was very important to the Shell Motor Company. The spaceship's cockpit was not very big, but because there were only 2 people sitting inside, it was much more spacious. Looking at the outline of the old moon behind him that was getting clearer and clearer, Sulu thought about the thrilling experience of the past few days. He could not help but feel a little shaken. A small fry talking reason with the big shots of the Federation, and so happily at that. It was really a very satisfying thing, so much so that he did not want to think about the big trouble it might bring. After the waiter delivered the wine, he left. Zhou Yu held the glass of wine in his hand and gently tasted it. Then he smiled bitterly and said, "Now that I think about it, you were right when you replaced me that day. If the one in the little white flower mecha was me, maybe we would have lost before we even reached the peak of Kaki Peak." Zhou Yu had purposely stayed at the base to wait for him. Sulu looked at the complicated expression on Zhou Yu's face and suddenly thought of the day when Bai Yulan was taken away by the Bureau of Proclamation. For excellent pilots like Zhou Yu and Bai Yulan, missing out on the first real battle of the new mecha was really a regret that could not be made up for in life. Zhou Yu seemed to have guessed what he was thinking. He finished the wine in his glass in one gulp and said with a smile, "It's a bit of a pity, but after watching the battle between you two, I don't feel too much about it." He looked at Sulu and shook his head ruefully. "Last year at Yue University, your mecha piloting skills were just so-so. Only half a year has passed. You should know that the purple sea that Mad Manly controls is really terrifying to the point of being unimaginable, but you still managed to hold on. I really don't understand. Maybe I'm just lucky." Sulu smiled and shrugged his shoulders. In reality, he knew best that he was able to hold on for so long at Kaki Peak because of the 10 stances that Uncle Feng had taught him. They seemed to be able to subtly counter the battle style of the Lees of Philadelphia. There was still a huge gap between his mecha piloting skills and that of Mad Manly, but this sort of similarity and counter of styles played a huge role. Uncle Feng Yu was really a mysterious character. After the dust of the presidential election settled, it looked like he really would have to go to Philadelphia to find out more. But would he still be alive by then? Sulu narrowed his eyes and imitated Shi Qinghai's actions. He slowly sipped his wine, letting the wine flow over his tongue and evoke a spicy aftertaste. The heavy black leather case was right under his feet. According to Zhou Yu, Secretary Shen was already in contact with the Bureau of Proclamation. Sulu knew that the person in the Federation who had influence over the Bureau of Proclamation was probably that Lady Tai. He immediately relaxed and no longer worried about Bai Yulan. The Bureau of Proclamation building in the outskirts of the capital was actually not very tall and dignified. Instead, it was more like a normal research institute. That highway that only allowed entry and no exit connected this independent institute to the Federation. And deep underground, in the distant universe, there were countless invisible lines that bound it to every inch of the Federation's land, making it impossible to break away. The Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation. Many years ago, it was also known as the Royal Bureau of Proclamation. In reality, this most important organization of the Federation, no matter what name it was called, only followed the 700,000-word First Charter. Following that was loyalty to the former emperor or the current Federation government. Whether it was Mr. President, the Federation Management Committee, or the enormous bodies of the 7 great families hidden in the shadows, none of them could move the Bureau of Proclamation's staff at all. But they were still living people living in the Federation. Humans had to breathe and eat, and they had to interact with others. There were conflicts of interest, and naturally, things that went against the principles of the charter would happen. This is the old man's investigation report. The middle-aged assistant director, whose hair was starting to fall off his forehead, walked into the office and said to the old man on the chair, "Director Tai, do you want to take a look? Federation mecha battle." Why did he run to the old moon base? He actually used his authority in this kind of place. How much money did the Li family give him for him to be so daring? The director of the Bureau of Proclamation held a crutch-like object with both hands and said in a deep voice, "Send the old man's investigation report to the Federation Investigation Bureau and invite him back for tea. Also, release that mercenary while you're at it." The Federation Military Court didn't even try this case, so why should we meddle? Yes. The assistant director took the case file but didn't leave. He said with a serious expression, "Last night, the central computer automatically generated an analysis report. Only I can see the content inside for now. Because this is a serious matter, I didn't give the authority to start the investigation." The old director narrowed his eyes slightly. He didn't know why his successor, whom he had cultivated for more than 10 years, was so shocked by the analysis report of the central computer that he actually used such a public tone instead of calling him the old man. His slightly trembling right hand left the crutches and lightly pressed the button on the right side of the office desk. A holographic light screen flashed a few times and appeared in front of him. On the screen was the analysis report that the central computer had generated after sorting out the information on its own. It was requesting the authority to investigate. The old director narrowed his eyes and looked at it for a long time, but he didn't say anything. Although the Bureau of Proclamation was independent of the Federation, the Bureau of Proclamation's organizational structure and staff were part of the Federation government. The object of suspicion in the analysis report of the central computer was so strange that he couldn't immediately make a decision. This councilman is in the prime of his life right now. Also, the suspicious points in the analysis report are too vague. We can't confirm the suspicion either. How do we investigate? The old director sighed and said, "If we let those old men in the management committee know that we are investigating him, they might use the crime of breaking the unity of the citizens of the Federation to cut our funding for next year." The assistant director shook his head and said, "I also feel that there is a problem with this report. Logically speaking, the central computer will monitor election information, but it has never paid so much attention to a presidential candidate." He continued with a frown, "This matter is a bit strange." After a long silence, the old director said, "Since it is the old man's report, we should investigate it. But I don't think we will find anything. Even if we can find out the problem with that councilman, it won't be of much use." The old man said with slight mockery, "Countless years ago, those useless ancestors of mine always said that a doctor can't be punished. Actually, the situation now is more or less the same. You should give the authority to the old man. Let him do what he wants. This old man, it seems he has been bored for too long." After nagging this sentence, the old director stood up shakily and walked out of the door. He was not holding a crutch in his hand, but a golf club. The Bureau of Proclamation would not allow the influence of the Federation to infiltrate. Thus, that high-ranking Bureau of Proclamation official who had gone to the old moon base had not even had the chance to enjoy the generous pension and manor in the Bermuda Star region provided for him by the Bureau of Proclamation before the Federation's Investigation Bureau was notified by the Bureau of Proclamation and brought back to S2 for tea. Director Jean and his assistant did not really understand why the Federal Central Computer would automatically generate a report for the presidential election. Actually, perhaps even the central computer itself did not really understand. That crystallization of human wisdom that had been through the baptism of who knew how many years was just mechanically or chaotically following a fixed program, arranging the sequence, collecting information, sensing the first to contact the target, to confirm the target's safety, to confirm the target's command authority, and then, in the spaceship, Sulu woke up abruptly. He wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead and gulped down a few mouthfuls of ice water with some lingering fear. At this moment, the victory of the Mecha Standards competition, Lin Yuanhu's infamous reputation, Professor Shin's consolation, and Madman Li becoming his nephew, these exciting events did not make him feel happy at all. Just like on the spaceship on the back of the old moon, Su Lu once again fell asleep during the journey. And once again, he dreamt. Once again, he kept thinking about Senator Macklin in his dream, but the final color of the dream turned into the most frightening black. In the black dream, that existence that called itself Old Thing appeared once again. This time, it did not actively contact him to confirm, but instead followed that reciprocating pathway and began to talk to him. Did he say something in the dream, or did he say something in his mind? Su Lu gulped down large mouthfuls of ice water, a hint of fear flashing through his eyes. This time, he was really dreaming, unlike that time when he was awake in the laboratory. He could not recall the feelings in the dream. What one thinks in the day, one dreams at night. Su Lu thought silently, thinking that what he wanted most now was of course to trample Senator Macklin to the ground, just like how he had trampled on Lin Yuanhu a few days ago. A soft electronic sound rang out, reminding the two passengers in the cabin that they were about to enter the atmosphere of planet S1. Please fasten your seatbelt and do not drink. The sound woke Su Lu from his thoughts. He instinctively looked out the window and saw the beautiful planet S1 taking up most of his field of vision. The thin atmosphere was like a layer of soft skin covering the outer edge of the planet. Outside the pale white boundary of the atmosphere, satellites of various types and purposes were suspended in their respective orbits, like haystacks in a wheat field. Among them, those surveillance satellites that were painted black were extremely inconspicuous. Just by relying on their high-energy batteries, these surveillance satellites seemed to be able to fly forever in space. This was part of the Federation's electronic surveillance network, part of the glory of the Charter. These were the eyes of that old thing. Zhou Yu noticed that Su Li's face was a little pale, and cold sweat was flowing down. He frowned and asked, "Did you have a nightmare?" He then smiled and comforted him. "I know that the last few waves of attacks from the Purple Sea were a little scary, but in the end, you won." Su Lu squinted at the satellites outside the window and shook his head. "No, there are too many things in this universe that are scarier than Madman Li." Chapter 262. There was no welcoming ceremony, no written commendation order, no news report, not even a single gathering. Su Lu returned to his apartment in the Wangdu district and sat alone on the sofa, eating his instant meal box and staring blankly at the news on TV. Only after several hours had passed did he finally shake off this somewhat absurd state of mind. No matter what the color of the dream was, since that dream kept happening, then it was really not a good choice to keep thinking about it, to the point where his face was pale, his body was thin, and in the end, he had coughed up blood and died. Su Lu used his own coarse nerves to temporarily forget that great existence, but he still could not get used to the silence of his apartment. Developing the MX mecha and participating in Ka Qifeng's mecha combat test, Su Lu had wanted to make Professor Shin's name belong to Professor Shin. He had wanted to give some big shot a slap in the face. He had wanted to indirectly strike a blow at the joint election of Governor Ross and Senator Macklin. However, he was still a young man after all. After Nutshell Company had successfully obtained the Federation's new mecha standards, as the most important participant, he had actually been forgotten by the entire Federation. Not to say that he would feel resentment, but it was still somewhat difficult to understand. He lowered his head and ate the vegetables in his meal box in big bites, crunching them loudly. Then, he drank a mouthful of water and raised his head to look at the news on TV. On the news screen, the spokesperson for the Federal Academy of Science was currently dodging the reporters' questions in an extremely awkward manner. The Federation had sealed off the details of the MX Mecha's testing, but they had not sealed off the news of the MX Mecha's passing of the standards. After all, this was an event that could greatly increase the Federation citizens' sense of honor and confidence. Unlike the details of the mecha battle being hidden, Shang Qiu had accused the Federal Academy of Science of plagiarism in the command hall that day. Under the evidence, Dean Lin Yuanhu had been forced to quietly admit it. This scene had been seen by too many people, and for some reason, the Federation government did not seem to spend too much effort to cover up this scandal. During the days that Su Lu had been at the Old Moon Circular Base, the entire Federation news community had been hyping up this plagiarism scandal. Many media outlets had begun to show their spirit of beating the dog while it was down, digging up the plagiarism controversy that had caused a stir on the public network a month ago. Some had even begun to directly discuss which parts of Dean Lin Yuanhu's academic achievements when he had entered the Academy of Science many years ago and received the Nebula Award had been copied from Professor Shen Yulin. The mindset of the media was different from that of the citizens of the Federation, but they could better grasp the mindset of the citizens of the Federation. The Federal Academy of Science was the most respected top-level academic institution within the Federation, and Dean Lin Yuanhu was the most revered scholar. This scandal would hurt the feelings of many citizens, but it was also the most eye-catching event. The media naturally would not let go of such a major incident. Who knew how many people were grieving at home as they watched the news, but the media would only continue to discuss it in depth. Unfortunately, they did not manage to find any more details of the incident, and the Academy of Science did not have the face to make any more excuses. Su Lu looked at the news, smiled, and then lowered his head to begin eating. Then, he raised his head again to glance at the news, and ate another mouthful of rice. His mood was incomparably joyful. As he was clearing away the dishes, Su Lu received a call from Major Jiao. He knew that this strange silence would soon disappear. After this call, he received a call from Zhou Yu, inviting him to eat at Linyuan. He rubbed his stomach. After Uncle Feng Yu had taught him that set of martial arts, his appetite had indeed increased by the day, so there should be no problem for him to eat another meal. Of course, even if he did not have the appetite to eat, this invitation was inevitable. In Linyuan Bamboo Residence, clear spring water slowly flowed past. Zhou Yu used two slender fingers to hold a maroon clay cup, gently sniffing the fragrance of the plum wine in the cup. Her eyelashes slightly blinked, and she secretly glanced at Su Lu across the table. A year ago, when they first met at the entrance of the nightclub in Linhai, Zhou Yu played the role of a cold and rude rich girl. At that time, her eyes actually paused for a moment on Shi Qinghai's stunning face, but she did not pay attention to this ordinary-looking young student at all, even though he had already displayed a rare persistence and loyalty to his friends. Later, because of some very strange things, the two of them actually lived under the same roof. It was during that time that Zhou Yu was incomparably amazed by Su Li's way of doing things. It was really difficult to find someone like him in the current Federation. At that time, she also came into contact with some of Su Li's secrets, and knew that this guy would one day shock the entire Federation. She just did not expect that day to come so early. Zhou Yu smiled slightly and raised her head. On that unadorned face, there was a faint scar on her lower jaw that was no longer clear. Her postpartum figure had recovered extremely well, but because she had to breastfeed herself, she could not even smell a hint of perfume. "I heard that you are now Madman Li's uncle." Zhou Yu asked with a smile, but there was a trace of lament in her words. Even that little lunatic who had defeated the unrivaled in the military and dared to charge into Parliament Hill to beat people up had actually been defeated by Su Li's hands. This was really hard to imagine. There's something wrong with that mecha he's piloting. Being too familiar with Zhou Yu, Su Lu did not care about his manners. He casually leaned back in his seat and shook his head, saying, "Otherwise, I'm not his match when it comes to mecha piloting." "What about close-range combat?" Zhou Yu narrowed her eyes and asked curiously. That day at the entrance to Tiger Mountain Road, she had personally seen Su Lu charge up the cliff, and had also seen him kill Madman Li in 3 strikes in Linyuan. She knew that this guy's individual combat strength was also extremely fierce. "You'll only know after we actually fight," replied Su Lu with a smile. You're just a person who looks gentle on the outside, but in reality, you won't tolerate the slightest bit of bullying." Zhou Yu looked at him quietly, thinking of that rumored bet. Probably only you would let the Lees of Philadelphia suffer such great humiliation and not worry about anything at all. He wants to kill me. It's not like you don't know. Su-lu took a sip of wine and asked, I heard that the military did an excellent job of keeping this a secret. How did news of this bet leak out? Any secret is not a secret in certain circles. Zhou put down her wine glass and said seriously, I'm seeing you today because some people have a few words for you. There are many people who don't know, but you're now already a captain in the Ministry of Defense's General Assembly base. Based on your results this time, it wouldn't be a problem for you to be directly promoted to lieutenant colonel, but it was suppressed by the higher-ups. Major Jiao already called me just now to explain, replied Su-lu. Zhou said with a trace of apology, the Nutshell Company originally prepared a very generous reward, but other than the bonus, the rest was also suppressed. Even now, many people still don't know that the person who defeated the mecha from the Federal Academy of Science was you. Su-lu was silent for a long time, then suddenly opened his mouth to say, I feel a little uncomfortable, but you also know that I don't really care about these things. I don't like this attitude. When it's time to fight, you should fight. Zhou paused for a moment, then said, but this time, you really shouldn't fight. This should be the madam's intention. Su Li's expression didn't show much surprise. He had heard Zhou mention this once at the Old Moon base. After returning to S1, he had also thought about this problem in his apartment. Using the Federation government and the military to protect the reputation of the Lees of Philadelphia, while at the same time hiding himself as much as possible, the only person who had the ability to do this was that Lady Tai. However, he didn't know why Lady Tai did this. Su-lu thought of Shangqiu. Could it be that the accusation of plagiarism in the command hall made the Tai family feel that he was too difficult to control? However, Lin Yuanhu's loss of power would be a great help to Senator Pabre's presidential campaign. The Tai family should be very clear about this, and the reaction of the Federation's press these past few days also proved this point. I haven't seen the madam recently, but according to my speculation, part of the reason should be related to your accusation of Lin Yuanhu. Zhou lowered her eyes slightly and ate the food that Su-lu had ordered for her. She said, you probably didn't pay attention to the name Lin Yuanhu. Dean Lin is actually a distant relative of the Lin family. There may be disputes between the 7 major families of the Federation, but it's very rare for them to be as ruthless as what you did this time. You directly knocked Dean Lin down to the ground and even stepped on him a few times. The madam might be a little unhappy with your behavior of acting on your own without asking for permission. Lin Yuanhu. Lin Banshan, Lin Dohai. Su Li's eyes narrowed. There were too many people with the surname Lin in the Federation. He really didn't think that Lin Yuanhu would be related to one of the 7 major families, the Lin family. He suddenly remembered that he was sitting in the middle of Lin Yuan. In this world, how could there be so many Lin Yuan? He lowered his head, laughed at himself, and said, ask for permission. The madam really does think of me as a member of her family. Isn't that so? Zhou quickly retorted, bringing with her a bit of original aggressiveness. Su-lu had long since gotten used to her tone of voice. In the past year, Zhou had always acted as his analyst, helping him analyze the situation and determine which way to go. Even as early as when the conflict of data in the laboratory had just occurred, she had pointed out that there was a presidential election behind this matter, which had been a great help to him. Of course not, Su-lu said after a moment of silence, everyone is an independent person, isn't that right? People are people of society. Zhou shook her head and reminded him, if you just want to muddle along for the rest of your life, you can still protect yourself. But if you want to rise up in the Federation and stick to your principles, you will only suffer a lot. Let's not talk about this anymore. Su-lu suddenly thought of something important and said seriously, 2 days after Lu Huo was born, I received a message from Shi Qinghai. That guy is secretly investigating Senator Macklin. I have already passed some important evidence to Shinli. After that, I couldn't contact him anymore, but I believe that he should be living quite well. Zhou Yu's thin eyebrows furrowed beautifully. After a long silence, she laughed softly and said, "What can that hooligan find out? I have said before, you better not mention this name in front of me." Little Lu Hua's parents were a very unfamiliar couple, but Su Lu kept telling Shi Qinghai's story in front of Zhou Yu. In Zhou Yu's heart, that Shi Qinghai's appearance gradually became clearer, and he didn't seem like a stranger. But she would often rationally think that the spy wandering in the Federation would definitely not be as familiar with her as she was with him. This was a tongue-twisting sentence, but it explained a heart-wrenching truth. Thus, she didn't want to hear that name again, and didn't want to have anything to do with that person. Mr. Shi is a very impressive guy. Su Lu thought of his good friend, who had always been taking great risks and doing things that couldn't be exposed in the dark for the sake of the light, and a sense of respect welled up in his heart. Zhou Yu and Su Lu were so familiar that with just one sentence, she knew what Su Lu was trying to express. She laughed softly and said sarcastically, "Is it really impressive to be as stubborn as a rock like you?" Lin Yuan's dinner time was very short, because Zhou Yu still had to go home to feed the baby. Su Lu sent her to the entrance of the Shishan compound. Thinking that this young and beautiful girl's most important daily life now was to take care of the child, he couldn't help but have some complicated feelings. "Come home for dinner the day after tomorrow. My father probably has something to tell you. Also, my mother keeps asking when you will be back from your business trip," Zhou Yu said helplessly after alighting from the car. Su Lu smiled and agreed, just like how he had promised Deputy Minister Zhou in the cemetery that he would be the scapegoat. His life might not be considered exciting, but it was definitely strange enough. How long would he have to be the scapegoat? The night at the back of Macho Mountain was so quiet. The picturesque scenery during the day, under the blowing of the cold night wind and the illumination of the two bright moons, lost a bit of the aura of a king and gained a bit of the charm of a young lady. The image currently being broadcasted on the holographic screen was not the plagiarism incident that had caused such a stir in recent days. In the dim image, two of the Federation's newest MX mecha were engaged in an intense battle. It was the very significant test battle that had taken place a few days ago on the summit of Old Moon Kaki Peak. The federal military and the Bureau of Proclamation had worked together to seal off the details of this mecha battle. All of the video footage and data had been sealed up after going through the necessary research at the main assembly base. Logically speaking, the appearance of these images on the holographic screen was already a serious violation of the Federation's confidentiality regulations. However, the person watching these images was that lady, so this matter seemed so natural. With a light touch of a button, the holographic screen slowly retracted into the wall. Lady Tai stood up from her chair and walked towards the kitchen, a trace of melancholy mixed within the calm expression on her face. The matter of sealing off the video footage of the battle was a suggestion that Lady Tai had made to President Sieg. On the surface, it was for the sake of the reputation of the Lees of Philadelphia, but in reality, only she knew what the most important reason was. The slightly trembling body of the white mecha in the image was so familiar. Although it was only for an instant, it was deeply imprinted in her eyes. Most of the people who had seen that person operate the mecha were already dead, but there were still some people who were still alive. That daring brat, was he not afraid of dying a horrible death? Lady Tai thought to herself with a sigh as she gently stirred the white fruit porridge in the white porcelain pot. Chapter 263. There would always be many cliché stories repeated in a bar, especially when a woman like Shang Qiu, who had the ability to cause a commotion, passed by. However, Su Lu always thought that he was not qualified to compete with others for a woman's affection, so the heavens would not arrange such a cliché story for him. But just as he walked a few steps out of the booth, he saw Shang Qiu snatch a glass of wine from the bar beside her and splash it directly on someone's face. Su Lu was slightly shocked. He rushed to Shang Qiu's side and held her arm. It was slightly cold to the touch, and the back of his hand was tender and smooth. It was quite moving. "Are you okay?" He did not have time to see who was on the other side of the conflict. He lowered his head and asked Shang Qiu, "Did someone reach out to you?" I'm not drunk. Shang Qiu frowned, but she did not know that she had buttoned the wrong button on her shirt. She waved her hand and said, "No one reached out. It's just that this guy said something about a young master wanting to treat me to a drink. His tone was very annoying." Su Lu was slightly stunned. He turned around and saw a middle-aged man wiping the wine off his face. Looking at the middle-aged man's attire, he should be a powerful figure in the Federation. However, he was only inviting her on behalf of someone else. He did not know who the person behind this was. He did not ask Shang Qiu how annoying that person's tone was because they were engineers in their bones and did not fit in with this society. Some people with power and money were used to looking down on others and using frivolity to represent their strength, but they could not get used to it. Of course, Su Lu was not worried that he would not be able to clean up the mess later. Although his role in the development of MX was forcefully suppressed by the government, Shang Qiu and the Nutshell Engineering Department's contributions were already set in stone. From a certain perspective, Shang Qiu was now a hero of the Federation. At this time, who would be stupid enough to provoke her? Even if they made a scene in public, they would only be at a disadvantage. "I just want to invite this young lady up for a drink on behalf of my young master. I don't know why I received such rude treatment." The middle-aged man standing not far away wiped the wine off his face and angrily asked. Su Lu knew the details of the matter, so naturally, he couldn't answer. He raised his head and looked up. In the luxurious partition on the second floor of the bar, there were a few young people in luxurious clothes whispering to each other. From time to time, they would turn their heads and look over, as if they were commenting on him or Shang Qiu. He narrowed his eyes and recognized one of the faces. He also found that the back of the person who was facing him was somewhat familiar. For a moment, he couldn't help but feel a little puzzled. Although this bar was the most famous high-end nightclub next to Capital University, with the identity of the young man's family, he shouldn't have come to such a place. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he wouldn't torture himself to apologize to the middle-aged man in front of him. He was about to leave with Shang Qiu when Shang Qiu said with a slightly red face, "I'm in a hurry." Su Lu immediately remembered this matter and walked forward with her. He was used to seeing Shang Qiu Qing Yan's strange appearance mixed with the spirit of an engineer. It was rare to see her blushing, so it was quite a pleasure. The middle-aged man clearly didn't expect this pair of man and woman to walk away like they didn't exist. Not only did they not apologize, they didn't even say a word of apology. Therefore, when Su Lu and Shang Qiu returned, there were a few more people blocking their way. "It really is a cliché," Shang Qiu said with a wink. Previously, on the way here, Su Lu had laughed and said this kind of cliché problem. The bar was very large, so not many people would notice the abnormality in this area. Even if they did, they would be blocked out of the area by people who had come from who knew where. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the people in front of him. He wasn't surprised that the other party would bring so many people to drink. After all, they were the children of aristocratic families. It was rare for them to experience the hardships of the common people, so of course they would pay extra attention to safety. At this time, a very calm voice came from above the isolated quiet area. "It's fine if you don't drink, but it's really not good for you to act like a shrew when you're so pretty. You should at least apologize to my subordinates." Some people thought that because they were elegant and calm, they could act like they were hiding needles in cotton wool. However, they didn't know that these words were really asking for a beating. Su Lu looked at the silently approaching Magnolia Bai. He heard Shang Qiu, who was beside him, shout directly to the upstairs, "This old lady wants to apologize to your mother." Shang Qiu was 24 years old this year. She worked in the underground of the Nutshell Engineering Department for many years, so she rarely saw the sun. Her snow-white skin, elegant face, and exaggerated figure were indeed very eye-catching. However, when she said the words "this old lady," it really revealed her character. As the technical director of the Nutshell Engineering Department, she was not as simple as a beauty. The young man upstairs couldn't sit still. His face darkened as he walked down the stairs. A quiet girl in the luxurious compartment looked at him with a trace of helplessness in her eyes. Su Lu looked at the young man walking down the stairs. His expression didn't change. However, when he saw Li Xiaotong, who followed him downstairs, he couldn't help but feel that it was a small world. It turned out that the familiar figure upstairs was actually the seventh young master of the Li family. When Li Xiaotong saw Su Lu, he couldn't help but be slightly startled. He immediately showed a bitter smile and said, "Dohai, don't mess around. This is my friend." It was a rare scene for two of the second generation of the seven great families to appear in this bar. The one who had asked his subordinates to invite Shang Qiu upstairs to drink was Lin Dohai. Lin Dohai's trip was originally to visit Lady Tai at the back mountain of Macho according to his family's wishes. However, he was coldly refused. He had to stay in the capital for a few days to see the situation. The Li and Lin families had been close in recent years. Li Qishao, who was in the capital, naturally had to do the reception work. However, Lin Dohai didn't want to go to those quiet clubs. He asked to come to the bar near the capital university. Lin Daohai made this choice because the quiet girl was studying at the capital university. He had invited Shang Qiu upstairs because he liked Shang Qiu's hot body. He wanted to vent his anger on the quiet girl. However, he didn't expect that the girl with the impressive figure seemed to have a strong background. Not only did she splash wine on his subordinates, but she was also called a friend by Li Qishao. After a moment of silence, Lin Dohai narrowed his eyes and looked at Su Li's face. He felt that it was somewhat familiar. Suddenly, he said coldly, "Li Qishao, I'll give you face and let them apologize." Li Xiaotong didn't answer. He just stood quietly to the side. After a while, Lin Dohai found that there was only silence. He looked back in surprise. He thought, "You're not the legitimate successor of the Li family. You were quite close to me before. I've already given you enough face. What else do you want?" "Li Qishao, I'll give you face and let them get out of the way. This matter will be over." In the silence, Su Lu suddenly said. However, even he felt that these words were somewhat awkward. Li Xiaotong's words were very pleasing to his ears. His usually gloomy face suddenly looked like a flower in the snow that had been washed by water. He smiled very gently and replied, "That's great. This bar belongs to one of my subordinates. I'll ask him to send you 2 bottles of good wine later." When the people on the stairs came down, Shang Qiu knew that the situation today was a little different. She had seen some children of rich families in the Federation, but she could clearly feel that the 2 young people on the other side today were obviously a level higher than those people. Whether it was the words or the information revealed in their actions, it all proved this point. So she fell silent. She wanted to see how Su Lu would handle this matter. But after this simple exchange, not only was Shang Qiu stunned, but Lin Dohai and his subordinates were also stunned. Lin Dohai said that he was giving face to Li Xiaotong, and Su Lu also said that he was giving face to Li Xiaotong. In truth, Li Xiaotong's last words were giving face to Su Lu. When had the descendants of the 7 great clans ever been so disrespected? Lin Dohai's face was so gloomy that it seemed like it would condense into ice. He coldly said, "Since that's the case, Li Xiaotong, don't blame me for not giving you face. That's too awkward. Face is earned by oneself, not given by others." Su Lu narrowed his eyes and expressed his opinion. He didn't pay attention to Lin Dohai, only looking at Uncle Kong behind him, who seemed to be facing a great enemy. He asked, "How have you been recently?" Kong Wu naturally wouldn't answer. His eyes had long since been fixed on the delicate man behind Su Lu. He didn't know when this man had slipped over, but he was even more aware of the terrifying strength of these 2 young people in front of him. If a conflict were to break out at this time, he simply wouldn't be able to protect his young master. So he walked over to Lin Dohai and whispered a few words. Lin Dohai's expression slightly changed. Only now did he recall that wine party in Gangdu. Associating it with the scene of that day, an unprecedented anger welled up in his heart. But this was, after all, Li Xiaodong's territory. Since the other party had already spoken and he didn't want to shed all pretense of cordiality, he could only wait until after the matter was over. Su Lu said to Li Xiaotong, "Where's Brother Zheng?" Li Xiaotong smiled bitterly. "I'll tell you in 2 days." Watching the man and woman leave, Lin Dohai was silent for a long time at the top of the stairs. He turned his head to look coldly at Li Xiaotong and said, "Don't you have anything to say?" Li Xiaotong glanced at him indifferently. He didn't need to explain anything, but he knew that this person had remembered Su Lu. In order to help Su Lu reduce some of the trouble, he opened his mouth and said, "He is Su Lu." Su Lu. Lin Dohai repeated this name silently in his heart, thinking that he understood Li Xiaodong's fear. The inside story of the mecha battle had been sealed, but it couldn't stop existences like the 7 great families from finding out the details. In his impression, this was an even crazier fellow who had forced Madman Li to call him uncle. Li Xiaotong ignored him and walked up the stairs, a cold smile on his lips. He thought to himself, the girl you wanted to force up to drink with is probably Shang Qiu from Nutshell. Even your family's Dean Lin was flipped over by this woman, so what do you count for? Lin Dohai stood where he was, unmoving. With the mention of Su Li's name, he thought of many things, including the commotion caused by the mecha battle a few days ago. The double humiliation made it impossible for him to stay in this bar any longer. Especially when he thought of that quiet girl who had been watching this scene from upstairs, he felt even more furious. He stormed off with his subordinates in a huff. Dohai still has a childish temper. "I hope he can change it after marriage," said Li Xiaotong as he looked at the quiet girl on the sofa. "My engagement with him has already been annulled, but he came to school to see me today. After all, we've known each other since we were young. Plus, he knew you were here too, so I didn't reject him. But I didn't expect him to lose his composure like this." The quiet girl gently brushed her fluffy black hair, a trace of sadness in her beautiful eyes. "It was Nan Xiangmei." "Annulled? When did this happen?" Li Xiaotong frowned. The annulment of the marriage alliance between the Lin family and the Nan family was naturally a big deal. Why hadn't there been any news about it? Nan Xiangmei didn't want to explain these personal matters, and it was even more inconvenient to say that Lin Banshan had boarded the train in the middle of the night. After all, this wasn't a glorious story for the two families. She gently blinked her eyes, and suddenly asked curiously, "The person downstairs was Su Lu, right? Are you familiar with him?" "You know Su Lu?" Li Xiaotong was surprised again. He felt that Su Lu was a person he couldn't see through. How could an ordinary Federation citizen seem to know people from the 7 great families? Nan Xiangmei sat quietly and said softly, "I guess you can say that." Then she nodded vigorously, as if she wanted to use this cute action to express her confirmation of this matter. "I met him on the train." Nan Xiangmei smiled, revealing her pearly white teeth. She wasn't familiar with Li Xiaotong, but she found that he seemed to know that person. "He's an engineer from Nutshell, how do you know him?" Li Xiaodong's hand that was holding the wine glass slightly stiffened. He thought of the racing in the suburbs of Wangdu, and the knife light in the ivy garden. He couldn't help but laugh at himself and said softly, "He's the biggest investment I've made in my life, and from the looks of it, it should be a steady profit." Li Xiaotong and Su Li's private dealings couldn't be hidden from the eagle-like eyes of the family elders. Li Xiaotong subdued the master invited by the family, Brother Zheng, but now Brother Zheng was transferred away. This should be a warning from the family to him. However, 7th young Master Li wasn't worried about this. Su Lu, whom he invested in, had begun to stand out in the Federation and shine. A firm calculator was a businessman. He would never place all his resources on one planet, and he would never place all his chips on one side of the planet. Just like a hedge fund, Li Xiaotong had invested in Su Lu a long time ago. After the battle with Ka Qifeng, this vision was bound to be praised by the family, although Su Lu had an extremely bad impact on the family's affairs. Nan Xiangmei looked at him who was lost in thought. She gathered her courage and asked softly with a slightly red face, "Can you tell me his contact information?" Li Xiaotong, who had always been calm and even gloomy, was dumbfounded when he heard this request. "Didn't you say you knew each other? It turned out that you just met by chance, but now you want Su Li's contact information." Although Li Xiaotong now considered himself and Su Lu as friends, he still felt that life was unfair. A guy who used to be a soldier made Zhou Yu, whom he and Mad Manly both liked, pregnant, and now seduced the daughter of the Nan family, who had the strictest upbringing among the 7 families. How could he summon the courage to chase after her? Chapter 264. Under the influence of the Tai family, the successful development of the MX mecha named Little White Flower was a product of the collaboration between the Tai family and Su Lu. Lady Tai had never doubted the performance of the MX mecha because she was the only person in the Federation who knew Su Li's true background. She had great confidence in that person. Lady Tai had only started to worry after the Federal Academy of Science had conscripted Li Feng. However, when she found out through secret channels that Su Lu had personally piloted the mecha into battle, her worry faded a little. After all, she had lived with that person for so many years. Su Li's final victory, in this lady's eyes, was a matter of course. Everything was still because she had an indescribable absolute trust in the strength of that old friend of hers, right? The pearl-like white bubbles appeared evenly in the ginkgo porridge. The porridge was slightly green in color and looked appetizing. The heat was just right. Lady Tai filled 2 bowls and took one for herself. She started tasting it in the spacious kitchen. She also knew about the bet between Su Lu and Mad Manly in the assembly base. As she cooked the porridge, Lady Tai thought that according to that person's seniority, Li Feng, that little tyrant, calling Su Lu uncle was really something very normal. "Madam, young Master Lin Dohai just called. He happened to be in the capital recently and wants to visit you on behalf of the family," Butler Jean said respectfully. Butler Jean said respectfully at the door. Most people in the Federation who wanted to contact the wife of the head of the Tai family had to go through Great Secretary Shen. Only the members of the 7 great families who had coexisted for countless years would go through Butler Jean. "I'm not in a good mood recently. I don't want to see guests." Lady Tai gently blew on the hot porridge in the bowl and said with a smile, "If those old guys in the Lin family can figure out when they only have Lin Banshan to rely on in their family, I'm very willing to meet Lin Banshan." Butler Jean understood the meaning behind Madame Jin's words. Naturally, he also knew how to reply to her call later. Lady Tai had indeed been in a bad mood for the past 2 days. Matters such as the presidential election and the standards of the new mecha did not cause her mood to fluctuate too much. Over the past 10 years or so, she had maintained a good personal friendship with each successive president. Just this point alone was enough to give her the right to treat everything in the Federation lightly. What made her feel a little unhappy was the accusation of plagiarism by the Nutshell Engineering Department against the Federal Academy of Science in the Ground Command Hall. The plagiarism incident had caused many people in the government and the management committee to feel dissatisfied. They felt that the Federation was unable to provide an explanation to the public. These people all felt that Lady Tai was behind this incident, and in the end, these feelings were all projected onto the Tai family. Lady Tai didn't care about the politicians' complaints, because no one dared to complain to her face. However, Su Lu and Shang Qiu didn't report this to Jose, which made the whole thing too passive. Regardless of how this incident would benefit the Tai family, the first thing that came to her mind was that the young man didn't respect her enough. Although Lin Yuanhu had always been independent of the Lin family, he was still a member of the Lin family. In recent years, there had been very few important people who could stand up for themselves. Just like that, he had been ruined by Su Lu. Previously, when Lin Daohai wanted to visit her, it was naturally also a careful test by the Lin family. "Madam, what orders do you have for me?" Secretary Shen walked in from outside. Seeing Madame Jean and Butler Jean eating porridge in the kitchen, he was slightly stunned. He had been in this manner for some time now. He roughly understood that there was still a long time before he could eat the porridge personally cooked by Madame Jean. Give Bryn a call. Lady Tai wiped her hands on her apron and casually ordered. The plagiarism incident in the Academy of Science was not a scandal that the upper echelons of the Federation wanted to see. However, strangely enough, President Sieg had no intention of suppressing this incident. She was very curious about this, so she asked Shinli to contact the deputy director of the president's office. Yes. Secretary Shin continued, there will be a live broadcast of the election debate in 6 days. I have made some arrangements for the news channel. Lady Tai waved her hand and stopped him from reporting. She said, I trust you to handle this matter. Since that little fellow Su Le had already rudely and insidiously overturned Lin Yuanhu, Lady Tai could only take advantage of this situation to gain more benefits. Senator Pabre's campaign office had been keeping quiet about this incident. However, the Tai family's influence on the media had already been highlighted. Lady Tai couldn't help but frown when she recalled Senator Pabre's deep voice and very direct rejection during the phone call today. She had never dreamed of being able to control a president, but she always felt that Senator Pabre was a little too independent. However, Pabre was someone who was going to be the president in the future, so Lady Tai would give him enough respect. However, she wouldn't treat Su Le the same way. What an unruly fellow, said Lady Tai in her heart. The most important thing in the Federation was rules. Su Le had been too unruly in this incident. Lady Tai thought silently as she mixed the green porridge. She decided to give this young man another chance for now, and there wouldn't be a next time. Secrecy, silence, no one cared about him. The invisible pressure in the air from all directions caused the battle on Kaki Peak to not bring any substantial benefits to Su Le. He didn't know that Lady Tai was doing this to protect his safety, but she was also warning him. Because he hadn't considered these two aspects at all. Would using the simulation system expose his identity as a fugitive? In the moment when his mind was filled with emotions, Su Le would not consider this point at all. As for the warning, he had already obtained what he wanted the most from the Mecha Standards competition, a victory in both logic and spirit. That was enough to satisfy him, not to mention that he had a friend now. Loneliness was a kind of illness. Su Le had always thought so, but he was often plagued by this illness. His closest family and friends had all disappeared in the vast universe, in the tide of people that was even wider than the universe, for some reason. So when he received Shang Qiu's call at the entrance of the West Mountain compound, he agreed without hesitation. This female engineer with a genius brain and full breasts had already become one of his most trusted companions in these past few days. The black car without a logo arrived at the bar in the southern entrance of the capital's special administrative region at 10 p.m. Capital University was near the southern entrance. This was a rare social university that didn't need to be built in Linhai. The streets around the bar were filled with beautiful girls wearing short trench coats. The bar's decor was extremely high-end. Su Le couldn't understand it, but he roughly understood that this place was at least much more high-end than those nightclubs in Donglin. Soft dance music mixed with an obscure rhythm. Although there were many people in the bar, because the area was too big, it didn't seem crowded. Young men and women gently swayed their bodies to the dance music. Dazzling geometric lights swept across the entire bar, occasionally mixing to form a three-dimensional star pattern full of a sense of space, branded on those youthful and restless bodies. Cheers! Several round glasses filled with strong alcohol were raised and lightly clinked, completely unable to suppress the happy shouts of the crowd. Other than Shang Qiu, there were also a few members of the technical team who had stayed behind in the capital who had come to attend this party. These engineers, who usually looked quiet and wooden, appeared much more relaxed than usual because of the successful development of the MX Mecha. In less than half an hour, they had already downed several bottles of good alcohol and were beginning to slurp their words. Back in the Harbor City Industrial Park, Su Le and his colleagues in the engineering department had only communicated through the internal network. But later on, after a series of meetings, they had quickly become familiar with one another. Sitting together was quite comfortable, but hearing the praises of those engineers, Su-lu couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Emboldened by the alcohol, the engineers walked towards the dance floor, preparing to get close to those young girls swaying their youthful bodies. Su-lu looked at them with a glass of wine in hand, and couldn't help but smile. He asked, "I remember that some of you seem to be married already." Married is about the same as not being married. After the failure of last year's experiment, everyone has basically been living in the engineering department. They rarely have time to go home, Shang Qiu replied, lying lazily on the densely woven sofa. Perhaps it was because she had drunk some alcohol, but Shang Qiu wasn't wearing those square spectacles. Her legs were pressed under her, and her body was leaning against the sofa, which made her ample bosom appear even more conspicuous. Today, she was wearing a very casual shirt. Inside the shirt was a light green tube top. Her snow-white skin peeked out from the opening of the shirt. Even in the dim bar, it was still so dazzling. Su-lu turned his head. Seeing the moving scenery in front of Shang Qiu's chest, he was momentarily stunned. He thought back to the moment when he had turned on the video feed for the first time in the engineering department's basement, and also the dumbfounded expressions of Lan Xiaolong and Zhou Yu standing behind him. This is a bit too big. He sighed in his heart. Under the influence of Uncle Fengyu, Su-lu definitely couldn't be considered a gentleman. However, after all, he hadn't experienced too many things between a man and a woman. With a trace of nostalgia, he turned his head away, not daring to be blinded by the soft white skin. He called Bai Yulan. After confirming that the Bureau of Proclamation didn't make things difficult for him, he felt a lot more relaxed. He asked Shang Qiu and told her to come to this bar for a few drinks. "Of course I don't have any objections." Shang Qiu said, "Your secretary Bai has actually done a lot for MX. You and I both know that." She paused, then suddenly raised the glass in her hand very seriously and said, "Su-lu, thank you." "What's there to thank me for?" Su-lu said sincerely. He gently touched her glass and said, "I just want to take back what originally belonged to me. Speaking of which, on behalf of Professor Shen and myself, I really want to thank you for what you said in the command center." The two sat next to each other. Su-lu looked at Shang Qiu's black and messy hair and realized that without glasses, she looked more beautiful and soft than usual. However, he felt a little awkward where his gaze landed, so he used his finger to point in the air. Shang Qiu followed his finger and looked down. She smiled. In fact, she usually paid a lot of attention to what she wore. If it weren't for the fact that they were in a relaxing place like a bar and in a semi-enclosed private booth space, she definitely wouldn't have unbuttoned her outer shirt. However, she didn't expect Su-lu to be so uneasy. "Don't tell me you're still a virgin." Shang Qiu didn't button up her shirt. Instead, she blinked and asked with great interest. The light was blurred, and there was a lingering fragrance in the glass. The woman beside him said a bold and direct sentence. Su-lu felt his face heat up. He raised his glass and didn't answer. In the quiet bar, there were occasional small disturbances, but they quickly subsided. "Why did you choose this bar?" "It's all young people playing here. Under the influence of alcohol, it's easy to have problems." Su-lu looked at the small stage in the depths of the bar. On the stage, there was a girl wearing a light blue skin-tight suit. She was singing and dancing to the music, exuding a faint blurred smell. The bar's decoration was very good. The design was very modern and charming, but it always looked like a place where young people should be. "Aren't you a young person?" Shang Qiu looked at him curiously. She didn't understand how she could hear such an old man's words from his mouth. Su-lu was slightly stunned. He realized that there was probably a problem with his mentality. He smiled and covered it up. Not long after, Bai Yulan walked into the bar and found the booth where everyone was sitting. When the two of them met, they didn't say much. They took a glass of wine and drank it in one gulp. A lock of black hair fell between Bai Yulan's eyebrows. He habitually lowered his head and filled Su Li's glass with wine. Then, he raised his head and thought about the scene he saw at the old moon base. He said softly, "Boss, I've been thinking about it these past 2 days. You gave me $20 million. Do you want me to refund you some money?" Su Li gave Bai Yulan the bank card not because he wanted to buy a horse with $1,000. It was because he had never thought of forming an anti-government organization in a social environment like the Federation. He just needed a capable and reliable helper by his side. In the original plan, Bai Yulan, as the Federation's most familiar pilot with MX, could help him develop it smoothly. He could also participate in the mecha battle. However, Su Li personally went to the mecha battle. In his normal work life, there weren't many places where he could use Bai Yulan. That was why Bai Yulan said those words. "What's wrong?" Su Li didn't think of this and asked in surprise. The slow rhythm in the bar, but the sound effects were not muffled. They covered the two people's conversation. Bai Yulan laughed lightly and said, "Other than making the bed, pouring tea, and killing people, I don't seem to have much use for you." At this time, Shang Qiu was already drunk. She didn't pay attention to what they were talking about. She buttoned up her shirt and walked out of the booth, preparing to go to the washroom. Su Li looked at her and couldn't help but laugh. Shang Qiu's white shirt buttons were done wrongly, which made her chest look even more exaggerated. Only now did he understand that women with amazing figures would attract the attention of others no matter what they wore. Sometimes, attracting attention wasn't a good thing. Shang Qiu swayed her way through the bar. The bar patrons all noticed this woman with a unique temperament and mesmerizing chest. Luckily, the waters of the Capital Special District were too murky. This bar beside the Capital University was also a well-known place that Shang Qiu had specially chosen. Although she attracted the attention of countless burning gazes, no one dared to approach her. After working together for so long, Su Li knew that Shang Qiu was not someone to be trifled with. Plus, there were so many companions in the bar, so he wasn't too worried about her safety. Instead, he was worried that she would pass out drunk when she reached the washroom. He looked in that direction worriedly, and after informing Bai Yulan, he followed her. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.